Today, women and LGBTQ people make up more than half of the American electorate and are more engaged than ever in our politics. Yet they remain marginalized in government and elective office.
It's important for women to have a voice in this democracy because we see women being disproportionately affected across our society in so many areas.
The power!
The reality is the news industry is already gendered. The 19th is working to level the playing field.
Our newsroom is named for the 19th Amendment, but with an asterisk, the recognition of the omission of certain women from the franchise, from access to the ballot.
We want to be carving our own way and bringing journalism that you're not going to be able to find anywhere else to the table. Our readers are people who care deeply about the intersection of gender, politics, and policy and want a more nuanced approach to that politics and policy journalism.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Live with the 19th.
With live events and interviews, the 19th is fostering civil conversations and community building that brings our readers into direct contact with the people who represent them.
There's never been a Black woman governor in American history.
I think that our newsroom being as diverse as it is, it means that we're looking and telling stories of women that maybe had not been previously represented in media before.
Our goal is to launch the first newsroom that is truly reflective of the nation's women and the LGBTQ community.
There's more women running now than ever have been before, and people want to be informed.
Because what we know is that women and LGBTQ people are eager to have conversations about politics and often do not feel like they have a safe space to do that. We want to create that community.
Newsrooms need to be more inclusive. They need to better reflect their communities. The 19th has the opportunity to do that from the ground floor, and we're not wasting that opportunity.
There's never been a better moment than right now.
The 19th is the newsroom that we've been waiting for.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final day of the 19th Represent Summit. I hope you are enjoying and learning as much from these conversations as I am. I'm Emily Ramshaw, the co-founder and CEO of The 19th, an independent, nonprofit newsroom that aims to empower you with the information, resources, and community you need to be equal participants in our democracy. It's been an extraordinary week, and we are ending our summit with perhaps the most important topic of all: who has a say at the ballot box? Our first event today is a conversation between former First Lady Michelle Obama and Valerie Jarrett. You'll also hear from our founding sponsor, the Supermajority Education Fund, on the women's voting block. After that, we'll look at what's happening to voter access around the country and meet the people fighting for voting rights in Georgia, Texas, and Virginia. Then we'll see a performance by the Linda Lindas. We'll wrap up the summit with our final keynote, a conversation with Sherrilyn Ifill on the state of voting rights at the national level. Before we begin, I want to thank those who made this week possible, including our founding sponsor, Supermajority Education Fund, our presenting sponsor, the Impact Seat, and supporting sponsors, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, the Facebook Journalism Project, and the Tory Burch Foundation. A final thanks to our media partner, the PBS NewsHour. A reminder that while sponsors help keep the 19th Represents free for viewers to attend, they play no part in the programming of our events. All right, let's get started. Former First Lady Michelle Obama created the national nonprofit When We All Vote to tackle barriers to voting access that limit electoral participation. She's here to talk about her passion for civic engagement and how she's mobilizing voters at the community level. Valerie Jarrett, the board chair of Civic Nation, will lead today's conversation.
Thank you, Emily. I also want to show my appreciation to Aaron Haynes and everyone responsible for putting together this very important 19th Represents Summit. And for a change, I get to be an interviewer chair rather than being interviewed. And who would I rather interview than my dear friend, the former First Lady of the United States, Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama launched When We All Vote back in 2018. And it's an organization dedicated to changing our culture around voting. And we are in the fight right now to make sure that every vote counts and is cast in a fair and accessible way. And so bringing her into the conversation, I also want to mention on a personal note that she is the daughter of a strong woman and she has 2 daughters herself. And I want to begin the conversation, Michelle, by talking about how did voting come into your life? How was it anchored in your family? And what lessons did you learn that then helped inform the way you helped Sasha and Malia not only understand the importance of voting, but also the importance of civic engagement and being active?
Valerie, thanks so much. Great question. I am thrilled to be here. Happy to be talking to you, my dear friend. Where do you begin? How did I come to see voting as an important act, as a part of my life? You and I are both Chicagoans, and some of it starts there. Chicago is a very political city. And I think you cannot be a citizen of that city and not be engaged and aware of what's going on politically. And that was true in my household, not just in my immediate household, but in my extended family. Everybody that I know talked about what was going on in that city, from who was the mayor, what was going on in terms of police protection, and what was going on in our parks. I mean, it was a conversation around the kitchen table, and voting was a part of that. So I can't think of the first memory as a child that I had about voting, because it felt like it was always a part of my life. My father was a precinct captain in the neighborhood, which meant that a precinct captain in Chicago is sort of like a political organizer that works with the city to work with the aldermen to, sort of keep an eye on what's going on in various neighborhoods to make sure people's concerns were being met, their garbage was being picked up, and on and on and on. And I remember at an early age going with my father door to door to our neighbors' houses, and him coming in and being invited to sit in the kitchen table. People knew who he was, so there was a feeling of importance. And he would sit and listen, oftentimes to a lot of elderly people, and just jotting down what their concerns were and passing that on. And he was the person who took me with him every time it was time to vote. I remember going with him to our local polling place, which was in the basement of a church around the corner of our house. And when I was young, those were the times you'll remember, Valerie, the old voting booths with the big, and they were metal and steel, and they looked really important, and you had levers you pushed and a lever that closed the curtains behind you, and it felt so important. My father had a disability, and it took him a lot to do anything, but he never missed voting. And he would walk in his crutches, and I, the little me that I was by his side, would stand as he signed his name, and all the people at the voting polls knew who my dad was. It just felt like an important, momentous occasion, something that you were supposed to do. It was something that no one in my family, I don't care what their educational background was or what their status was, everybody voted. So I really, for the life of me, can't remember a time when I didn't think it was important, that I didn't realize that it was important to vote. That was always a part of my memory. So I carry that tradition on, Barack and I, obviously, with our girls. And we were a little different because my husband was in politics. We were always going door to door canvassing and talking to our neighbors and working on an election or trying to get people to sign up for a petition. And our kids were with us. Malia and Sasha were with us in these endeavors to the extent that they could be. So again, in our household, like it was in mine, voting was just a part of what you were supposed to do to be an engaged citizen. And I try to pass that on to the girls. We make voting a big deal. When they, we make getting their registering to vote as big a deal as getting their licenses. And I think that's what we all need to do in our households, is to be talking every day, not just about voting, but about the issues that matter in our lives. And I don't think it's too soon to start engaging kids in those conversations so that they understand that they do have a voice. They do have control over what happens in their communities, in their neighborhoods, so that it becomes a part of who they are, as it has been for me. And Valerie, I know the same thing is true for you.
Yes, indeed. Well, so let's come to the current time. And obviously, Michelle, this last year and a half has been traumatic and painful for so many people across the globe. But we know it's been really hard on women. And so I hope that you would share a little bit about what you think the role is that women should and could play in this new era that we're entering into, particularly in the area of civic engagement. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I could go on and on. Just like with everything, women, we are the bedrock of our families and our communities. And as we go, so do our families and our communities. We lead on issues like these. We set the tone in our households for how we get our health care, where our kids go to school, all types of basic things. So we play that important role in terms of bringing home the importance of voting and being engaged in our communities. So I think that our role is no less important today, even facing these issues, than it always is. We set the tone. So we have to be informed and engaged and having these conversations and encouraging our children and the next generation to do the same. But we're seeing now that women are always at the helm of historic gains. We're seeing this with Stacey Abrams, with our Vice President Kamala Harris. I'm trying to do my part with When We All Vote to make sure that, in a time when our voting rights are under attack, when people are trying to take the very power that we have to use our voice away from us, making it harder for us to vote, doing the most undemocratic things you can imagine, it's going to be up to us as women to step up and make sure that our communities are protected, that our kids are informed, that the issues that we care about are being addressed, and that we are not being silenced. So I encourage every woman within an earshot of my voice to think about ways that they can be involved. I encourage you to join us with When We All Vote and find ways to get involved in rallying your families and your communities, getting involved in your schools, teaching our young people the importance of what's going on. And now is the time to not get complacent. Things are better than they were, thankfully, because we have more stable leadership, but things are far from stable. Democracy is taking a hit right now. And if we're going to avoid watching things go backward, we are going to have to be engaged, and we're going to have to be focused. And there are many, many ways to get involved. And I know that this important gathering is just one way, but there's so many people out there working hard to make sure that we don't fall backwards. And women, we've got to make our voices heard.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle, for that inspiring challenge to us all, because you're right, the stakes are incredibly high. We appreciate you participating in this conversation to ensure that women are playing a very active and engaged role in protecting and expanding our democracy. And I know that our team over at When We All Vote is looking forward to seeing more women join us in this fight. And so please head over right now to whenweallvote.org and join us today. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Mrs. Obama and Valerie, for sharing your passion for voting rights with us today. We hope you're all enjoying the conversation so far and tweeting and sharing what you're learning using the hashtag 19threpresents. You can also sign up for our free newsletter at 19thnews.org/subscribe, where you can find out about upcoming 19th News events. And now, a brief segment on the transformative power of the women's electorate from our founding sponsor, Supermajority Education Fund, which provides resources, education, and training for young women and women of color to be more civically engaged. Cecile Richards is the co-founder of Supermajority and the former president of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Ai-jen Poo is the executive director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and the co-director of Caring Across Generations. Amanda Brown-Learman, the Executive Director of Supermajority, will lead the conversation.
Thank you, Emily. I get the pleasure of kicking off this conversation with Cecile and iGen. And Cecile, I'm going to come to you first with the question, actually, which is, we started Supermajority to meet this need around women's participation and activism coming off of the Women's March, and women showing up as voters and volunteers and as donors. And there was also this existential threat that we faced around our rights and our lived experiences every day, and the fact that, you know, we were still these outspoken advocates. So I would love to hear from you how you sort of reconcile the moment that we're in with the energy that women have, the enthusiasm, and also the maybe fatigue that women have right now with where we are in the moment, and also the opportunity that we have right now.
Well, I think you hit on it right. Which it's like, I think people, it almost seems like ancient history that 4 years ago, of course, there was this mass outpouring of women, multiracial, multi-generational, on every issue imaginable, that marched in every town and hamlet. And I think that what makes me so optimistic about this moment is that could have been just a moment in time, but in fact, what it was the launch pad of what we've seen over the last few years. And of course, Supermajority was really set up to answer the question millions of women are asking, which is, how can I make a difference in the world? And we've seen since then, you know, a record number of women running for office and getting elected, including the first woman vice president. We've seen that women's issues are now actually being discussed at the federal level, issues that women have cared about forever. And of course, a recognition that women are the majority of voters in this country and have been since the 1960s. I think that was a little known fact. In fact, Erin Haynes from the 19th said something which I've always loved, which was, what if the answer to who is electable is who will women vote for? And so I feel like things have kind of been flipped on their head. And it does give me enormous energy to see that as we're pulling out of this pandemic, that the issues that women care about, whether it's paid family leave or caregivers, home care workers, are finally being talked about at the highest levels. And that is a sign that women have, I think, actually we're on the agenda and driving the agenda. But of course, no one's seen that better than iGen, who has been on the front lines and certainly seen how women have stood up in this pandemic as frontline healthcare workers, as frontline caregivers, and activists. And so I would be curious, iGen, what is encouraging to you about this moment? What are you seeing on the ground with women that sort of is a predictor of where we are headed?
Well, what's amazing to me, Cecile, about this is that women, I mean, even just thinking about the pandemic, women have been on the front lines of every dimension of this crisis, from working disproportionately in these essential sectors that have also largely been low-wage sectors, where it's been really hard to survive without paid sick days or health care. Women have been going to work, keeping us safe as essential workers, and have been put in these impossible situations of having to navigate caregiving at the same time, having to actually millions of women being pushed out of the workforce because of the challenge of navigating work either online or as essential workers, and navigating kids home from school and daycare, and parents being on lockdown in nursing homes. It's just been so much, especially for women of color who have really borne the brunt of it all. And at the same time, we saw women mobilizing, leading, organizing, responding, both to the pandemic and to the crisis in our democracy. And the fact that we saw unprecedented turnout in the last election has everything to do with the incredible determination and fire that women have to solve problems, to have their voices heard, and to really lead in this moment. And I just think that has been proven over and over again in the last year. I have seen the incredible multiracial, multi-generational coalition that you talked about of women emerge and work together in communities across the country to make sure that women knew how to vote and vote safely in the pandemic, that women knew exactly what was at stake for our families and for the future of the economy. And, you know, the years of work that women have done in local communities, like in Georgia, where hundreds of thousands of voters were registered to create the context for the transformation that the state led for our whole country. Or in Michigan, where we were all on these phone bank calls, where we had thousands of volunteers calling other women to educate them about the issues and the candidates who were on the ballot, educating them about wearing masks and early voting and vote by mail. I mean, it just was so incredible in every corner of this country what we saw. And so I was so proud to be a part of this incredible army of women who made it happen in the hardest of circumstances. And, you know, with that, I mean, Amanda, the work that women have done, it's work that didn't start in 2020, didn't start in 2016. Of course, there was this massive surge of all of us going like, it's on us, we've got to make this happen. But now we're in this new period, right? This period of transformation and progress. Women in positions of power where they're able to elevate other women and the issues that we've always been working on and that have always been central to our lives. And women like teachers and caregivers and all the women who've been at the forefront and the backbone of our economy. You are a mom, Amanda, of 3 young daughters, 3 beautiful girls. When you think of the progress that is possible for women, if we keep organizing and we keep building our power, flexing our muscle in this way, what will it look like in 10 to 20 years for your girls?
I love this question. And it is true that the best sort of motivation is thinking about a world that I want so much more for my own children. I want so much more for women across the country as well. And I believe so deeply that we can get there. At Supermajority, we've laid out, the majority rules, which helps us to all reimagine and redefine what a world that actually looks and works for women can look like, right? And we can get there. And I think the thing, and you said it so well, of just there was, this surge. There are now finally people that are listening to us, bringing us in and, inviting us to have seats at the table. Women are running the show and, sleeping on the steps of the Capitol and demanding change. And you're just seeing this and experiencing this in a way that we cannot let up right now. The moment is now, and we are the change that we have been waiting for. And it is time to capitalize on our collective power and just do the damn thing and change it. And the opportunity that we have right now is the thing that really does keep me invested and motivated and going on the days that, some days are hard being a mom of 3. It's total chaos. You're actually getting a good view of my clean house right now, but it is hard and it's exhausting and it's tiring, but if we don't do it right now and keep our, pedal to the metal right now, I don't know what it will look like. And I do just think that when we organize, when we come together as the voters that we are, as the storytellers that we are, the community organizers that we are, we will change it. We will get there. We will find that progress and I'll be able to tell my 3 girls that I was a part of that for them and that their world will be different than, how I experienced it. So I think to your point, we are building this army. We need more people in this fight, in this work with us, and we will only be stronger together. And so here at Supermajority, we're inviting more people to dare to dream about what this world is and be a part of the good work that's going to get us there. And you can go to supermajority.com/rules to join us in that. But I will just tell one really great story that I think ties this all together. Is I was literally just on a Zoom with some organizers for the first time, these young women who are just getting started in their organizing career. And she said that she read an article, a 19th article, that she saw somebody post in pantsuit and then joined a phone bank that she was oh my God, you can do a dance party while you're phone banking. This is cool. I'll keep coming back. And she was asking me about how to make organizing, how to make that a career trajectory for her. And I was just like, this is what it's all about. Thank you, Allison. Like, this is what we're trying to do for more women across the country. And it really is full circle. And I think just goes to show to what women organizing looks like. And thanks to the 19th and supermajority for, pulling those pieces together for people. And with that, I'll turn it back.
It's time to learn about the state of voting rights across the nation by talking to those working at the community level. Let's go to Georgia first. After taking center stage in the presidential election, Georgia lawmakers put in place restrictive new voting measures, prompting several other states to do the same.
Tony Watkins is the Deputy Organizing Director of the New Georgia Project, which has registered 500,000 Georgians to vote since 2014. Aisha Yaqub Mahmood is the Executive Director of the Asian American Advocacy Fund, which engages Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in progressive politics. And Lauren Grow-Wargo is the Chief Executive Officer at Fair Fight Action, which advocates for election reform at all levels. Previously, she was the campaign manager for Stacey Abrams for governor.
The 19th's General Assignment reporter, Marielle Padilla, will moderate this conversation. Marielle?
Thanks so much for being here. I'm very excited to talk about this very important issue today. Republicans have introduced more than 400 restrictive voting bills and passed roughly 30 in states across the country. Senator Amy Klobuchar recently said that Georgia passed the country's most egregious voting law this year. As organizers on the ground, did the passage of this law surprise you? And let's start with Tony.
Hey there, thanks so much for having me. Yes and no, right? So unfortunately, in a place like Georgia, where we are constantly on the defense against conservatives and Republicans who want to suppress the votes of so many people that look like me and other folks that are watching this. But it's also like the audacity, right? So unfortunately, it feels very familiar, but there was still kind of this moment where we were hoping that the work we'd done would be enough, right, to have the corporations put the pressure on them when in a timely fashion, when it actually mattered, as opposed to after the fact when it was very clearly theatrical, right, and not actually to use their power for influence. So again, yes and no. Unfortunately, this feels very predictable from the people that we fight against, but we definitely did have some hope in the work that we were doing, and just that the right and righteous thing would have prevailed.
Great. And how about you, Lauren?
Look, Republicans in states that used to have to go through the Department of Justice to pre-clear voting changes, once the Supreme Court ruled in 2013 in the Shelby County decision that racism in voting was over, and that states in the South and in jurisdictions across the North that had a history of racial discrimination in voting no longer had to pre-clear any elections changes through the Department of Justice. Those laws were in place so that if there were precinct closures in predominantly Black neighborhoods, the Department of Justice would have to give approval to that county or state to do that. After that law, Voting Rights Act was weakened in 2013 by the Supreme Court, we saw a whole slew immediately, like in the days following, states like Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, and others started making moves to restrict access to vote. We saw over 200 precinct closures across the South after 2013. We saw changes in voter registration processing through things like exact match in Georgia, which makes people who have a hyphenated last name or an accent in their name very hard to get registered. So basically, as we've lived in this post-2013 era, we have seen an onslaught of voter suppression. And the voter suppression is just getting more and more surgical and thoughtful. So it was not a surprise that Georgia was sort of the tip of the spear. Literally here in Georgia, Tony, Aisha, myself, and our teams, we had a runoff election on Tuesday, an insurrection on Wednesday. And then the following Monday, Georgia and the Arizona legislatures went into session, and we saw this cavalcade of bills. But look, the organizing did matter. Georgia was the first state to introduce what we then saw became a clear heritage and right-wing effort across the country to the 400 bills you referenced, Mariel. But what we did do with tremendous pushback across the state, inside and outside strategies, some loud strategies and quiet strategies, we got out of that bill some very horrible things. They tried to ban Sunday voting. They tried to get rid of mail voting overall, because Democrats and people of color had used mail voting so strongly in 18 and 20 and 21. We got those really horrible provisions out of the bill because of the organizing. And sometimes winning in tough states feels like losing, because yes, the bill is horrible and very harmful, but organizing matters, participation matters. So we encourage everybody to go to stopjimcrow2.com and get in the fight in the states today, because though a horrible voter suppression bill did pass, we made it less bad. And in a state like Georgia, that's a win, because we're going to keep fighting.
Great. And I want to kind of talk more about the people and the impact of this law. Aisha, I know that Asian Americans are the fastest growing population in the state. What does voter suppression look like for these communities?
Yeah, voter suppression for Asian American communities oftentimes doesn't even appear to be voter suppression. It's those sorts of things that make it harder for people to even want to vote. These are people that have moved here from other countries, maybe have never voted before, and have incredible barriers to even being able to register to vote. So for our communities, voter suppression is everything from not having language access and not being able to understand how to register to vote in the first place. It looks like exact match and being kicked off the voter rolls because the way that you spell your last name isn't easy enough for the clerk at the voter registration office to pick up on. It looks like having to go and get your ballot, go to fix your ballot because your ballot was rejected because of a signature mismatch. So it's all of those very small things that some of us take for granted because things might just be easier if you speak English as a first language. And so I think for our communities, the voter suppression that we felt in this past cycle has really been rooted in some of these things that we have just been, we just haven't had access to over the last few years. And as we fought through this past, I say fought through this past election cycle because it was a battle, there were other things that came up and really stood out for our communities. We knew that Asian American communities took advantage of mail-in voting and early voting. 85% of Asian Americans that voted in the 2020 general election had already voted prior to election day. That means they took advantage of mail-in voting. They took advantage of early voting. And voter suppression looks like trying to cut early voting locations. It looks like trying to make it harder for people to use absentee and mail-in voting. So all of these things obviously impact other communities as well, but we know have directly gone to hit our communities very hard.
Great. Tony, I wonder if you can speak to what you're seeing on the ground. What are some of the main obstacles that people are telling you that they are, approaching when trying to vote?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of the things that Aisha was talking about. We have a special election coming up in September. That is really going to be one of the first times that we see these voter suppression laws really having that impact. So I'm seeing people trying to scramble and figure out how they're going to do their ID stuff because they don't know anybody with a scanner or a printer. And then after I scan them, then what? How does this process work? Nobody's really clear on how these laws are going to actually roll out. So there's a lot of trepidation with people that are already engaged, and then pulling people in who are not trusting of this system, right? Because they do understand that it is built in a way that is meant to suppress and oppress them. However, getting them to engage, to kind of rage against this machine is definitely more challenging, I think, and with some pockets of people, because it's just like, again, look at all of the stuff that we do, and here we are. Just like Lauren was saying, sometimes winning feels like losing. And I think there are a lot of people who now are experiencing the other part of the SB 202s and the voter suppression tactics that we don't really talk about, which is just trying to exhaust voters. So yes, we have all of the logistical issues that are problems, but we can organize around those, right? There aren't a lot of people, we're frustrated by it, but we can work around the lack of being able to give people food and water at the polls. Okay, fine. We will buy the printers, but what is the harder thing to do is convince people that it actually matters even more right now, because they are working so hard while they are in the midst of a pandemic, while they are trying to keep their lights on, find a new job because they were laid off from the other one because of COVID. And now the housing markets are back in flux because the referendums are ending. So all of these things are happening exactly at the time that we're trying to get marginalized people to vote. And that is probably the hardest thing that I think we're facing, even more than the specifics of SB 202, is the impact on the emotional, I think, ability and capacity that people have to keep fighting every day.
Right. Last year, Georgia saw a record turnout in the 2020 election. Lauren, can you speak to what was pushing this surge in turnout, and do you anticipate the new legislation to affect those numbers in coming elections?
Absolutely. So Georgians made history in the first time in many years that we won the state for the Democratic presidential nominee, and then turned around and carried the U.S. Senate on our backs and delivered Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff to the U.S. Senate. And so, look, flipping Georgia has been a massive effort. And it wasn't just the tremendous work that happened last year, the tremendous voter protection efforts, organizing turnout efforts in the diverse communities in all 159 counties. That is absolutely part of the story. But it's also part of the story of you cannot be what you cannot see, and people did not think Georgia was a battleground state, except that for more than a decade, all of us have been building that battleground state together. That's looked like winning tough district attorney races in South Georgia. That's looked like slowly chipping our way into larger Democratic majorities in the state legislature, though we're still shy of flipping those chambers. This has been a 10-year plan. I met Stacey Abrams 10 years ago, and she and I charted out a pathway on how we could influence the state, and with our teams, and building and supporting a whole ecosystem of grassroots organizations and organizers. So it's been a massive effort over a long time, and sometimes winning feels like losing. Sometimes it's, making progress and delivering for our communities. It's cutting deals with Republicans and others when you don't have enough power, but trying to look out for communities. And then it looks like this huge multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition of both organizations and voters. Georgia has the fastest growing Latino and Asian American populations in the country, combined with a Black population that's steadily growing. Whites go into the minority of the population this coming decade. And so we have a huge demographic shift that's been building and a huge change in power. And so it's all about how do we empower communities to take that power and to express it. And to part of what Tony said, part of the moment right now is a lot of confusion. Because remember, all these voter suppression bills are built on disinformation, lies, conspiracies. And so that has not stopped. We were ground zero for all disinformation, all foreign and domestic hate and ugly disinformation during the runoff. The foot was not taken off the gas there by bad actors. That has continued, and that is insidious and in our communities. It shows up in all kinds of ways. It shows up in vaccine disinformation. It shows up on this hateful, racist conversation about critical race theory. The lies around election integrity are connected to these other conspiracies, and they are infecting our communities and neighborhoods, causing confusion, causing people just to want to step away from civic life. That is part of modern voter suppression. And so there is a lot of confusion, and we're going to continue to do that voter education work to mitigate it. But the other thing that's happening right now in Georgia, as well as Arizona and other states, is this election subversion activity that is tied and always has been tied to voter suppression in our country's history. So right now, the biggest county in the state, Fulton County, that's predominantly Black, who's run by Black leaders, the Secretary of State and the governor and state leaders are trying to take that county board of elections over. They gave themselves that power. That's part of what they gave themselves the power to do in that bill. And so they are making moves to further discredit local elections officials, feed the lie of voter fraud, and try to take power. So that is one of the very pernicious parts of this bill. It's not only the voter confusion and new ID requirements and restrictions on voting, it's the levers of election administration power. So that means, what can we do, right? Well, first, we need to get For the People Act, we need to get the VRAA done, but we also need to engage locally. Go to your county board of elections meeting. Don't let it just be people who believe in conspiracies. You need to show up to those meetings and speak up for voter access. Get the back of the local election administrators, those who are trying to do good. Not all of them are trying to do good, but the ones that are, be there for. We got to really get engaged. And so civic engagement in this democracy crisis we're facing is going to look a little bit different than just going and casting a ballot, right? It's getting our friends, our family, and community to cast that ballot, but also engaging in this election administration. We own our democracy, so we got to engage in it.
Right. In terms of what the government can be doing, do you feel like the state legislators are doing enough, or that they are doing all that they can given the partisan nature of this issue? And if state legislators are unable to make these changes, do you think the federal government can or should be doing more? And let's start with Aisha, and then we'll go to Tony.
I for sure think that our federal government needs to be doing more and needs to do more now. We definitely need to make sure that we have some federal voting rights legislation tomorrow, because we have some incredibly important races coming up this year, incredibly important races coming up in 2022. And we want to make sure that our voters have the confidence that they need to go out and cast their ballots. Do I think that the Democrats in our legislature did enough or are doing enough? I always think that there's more that can be done to make sure that we're bringing community input and community stories back into the legislature. The fight against SB 202 this past cycle, this past legislative session, we saw so many voters, so many community organizations and organizers there day in and day out sharing their stories, talking about their experiences at the polls, election workers talking about their experiences at the polls. And I think we need to see more of that. I call on our legislators to make sure that we're continuing to incorporate that community input in the next fight that we're going to see. But there's also important work happening right now on redistricting, and that's where we really need our legislature to step up and make sure that we're also protecting our voices through that redistricting and making sure that our votes are protected and we have fair maps for this next cycle.
Yeah, I agree. To just be candid, definitely not, right? Prime example, on March 25th, when Representative Park Cannon was arrested for knocking at the governor's door, the sequence of events that led up to that are really interesting. So we, NGP, and a few other protests or organizations were demonstrating at the airport. They found out that the governor was getting ready to sign the bill, so we let Representative Cannon know. She also let her other colleagues know that this was happening, and only she and Representative Erica Thomas were the people that chose to show up to even put any level of pressure on, right? So, and that's just like a really large example of something where you can just even be present, because unfortunately in the state of Georgia, the Democratic state legislators that really do go to bat for us, I can count them on my hand probably, but definitely within both hands, right? So we do a little bit too much compromising. We don't do enough fighting, and we are too friendly, I think, with people who make their business off of killing our people and suppressing our votes and silencing our constituents, or their constituents, I should say. So absolutely not. We need to have elected officials that are willing to put their, excuse me, I hate to say it, but their careers on the line to fight for the things that they said they would fight for when we elected them. And I think that recognizing that even the people that we think are on our side are very lackadaisical about this, because they have acquiesced to whatever level of power they were looking to have. So many times they feel that their job is done. They don't have to respond to the things that we are telling them that we want and need. And so they don't. So unfortunately, we have to fire those people too, the same way that we're saying we will fire Republican state legislators that continue to suppress and oppress the voices of Black, brown, young, queer, golden people. We have to do that same stuff, and those same firing and hiring of the people who don't do that, that tell us that they're on our side, but don't show up when it's time to fight.
Yes, well, I'll agree with my colleagues that obviously more can always be done. We are in an existential fight. We have a triple threat of a pandemic, a global climate crisis, and a democracy crisis, all of which is felt disparate or differently by different communities, and especially in the South, where we have the highest maternal mortality rates. We have an expanded Medicaid. We have a poverty economy here in the South. So we are feeling that acutely. Our hospitals are filling up right now, and there is just raging disinformation. So we need our federal government to step up and do what they can. It is a whole new day in Georgia. We have a congressional delegation that is much more representative of the people, and our senators, our US senators, are present and showing up in communities and fighting. It's the first time I've ever seen that since I've been in Georgia. And they are demanding action on voting rights. So I feel as though the folks we have charged with that battle at the federal level are doing everything they can to push Congress, because we need, for the People Act, we need the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And let's be clear, those are just one of many things that need to happen. We will still have an unbelievable voter suppression fight on the ground, even with those bills passed. But those bills need to get the backs of organizers and voters doing the work and give us more tools in our arsenal to fight back against this level of attack on our democracy. So really right now, the ball is in their court, while everybody locally organizes to protect local election administration, to shore up our boards of elections members. There's just a big story a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times about 2 Black women who got kicked off their board of election posts, both in small rural counties. And that wasn't in the big bill that passed. That was in local legislation that passed. It's moves to make it harder for voter advocates to fight for their people, especially in smaller counties that don't get as much scrutiny. So there's so much going on the ground, and folks who want to get engaged really need to look locally where they can support, while demanding that Congress do their jobs and pass a ban on partisan gerrymandering, that they actually create some strong national standards for voting, and get Georgia back under preclearance. I don't think there's any confusion that racism in voting is over. After what we've seen the past couple of years in Georgia, it is naked and plain what the other side is doing. I'll give you an example. In SB 202, they are throwing out provisional ballots in Georgia, making it harder to cast a provisional ballot. So if you show up in the wrong location on election day and you vote for president or senator or governor, and you should have your poll location changed, you were confused, you should have showed up a couple streets over in your right location. If you show up now, that vote will be thrown away, even though you're a lawful voter. And why are they going after provisional ballots like that? If you show up in the wrong location, Joe Biden won the state by 11,000 votes in November. There were just about that many out of precinct provisional ballots that were counted last year in the presidential. That's what I mean. They're getting more surgical. If they would have thrown those out of precinct provisionals, and that's literally Mariel going to the wrong location to vote, but you're a lawful registered voter and you cast your ballot for a statewide, so there's no district issue. That in and of itself would have flipped the election just last year. So that's where they're going surgical, and then they're going wide on confusion and disinformation. We're seeing similar bills pass all over the country that are hyper targeted towards voters of color who disproportionately vote out of precinct, going towards Democratic voters, et cetera. And so we got to demand the federal action, and then we got to organize locally. We really got to organize locally. They have to go together, right, at the same time.
Right. And thanks for bringing that up. It looks like we only have about time for one more question. So let's talk about the work that you all are doing as organizers and advocates. What kinds of things are you doing? And do you have any advice for other organizers in other states about what should happen next? And we can start with Aisha and then go to Tony and then end with Lauren.
Yeah, I think coming off of this legislative session, we did a lot of education and accountability work with our legislators, making sure that they understood how we felt about the laws that had just passed. But we also had to do a lot of education back into our communities about what just happened. And we had to make the connection for them and help them see that the voter suppression legislation that we saw was a direct result of our community showing up and casting their ballots and making their voices heard in the past cycle, and that the attacks on our voting rights were directly linked to Republicans recognizing that Asian Americans and other communities of color have an important voice in this work. And that really got our communities motivated and activated and ready to push back. And so the work that we're doing now is really channeling that anger, channeling that frustration into local races. It's channeling that frustration and that anger into redistricting and making sure that we can get fair maps. And that's getting us geared up for 2022 when we can take back some of these legislative seats that we couldn't get to in 2020. And that's making sure that we can help elect a governor and secretary of state that's more reflective of the communities that we're serving. And that means just making sure that we are staying connected and accountable to our communities. Now, after COVID and after this voter suppression legislation, what we're doing differently is that we're spending more time and effort on our end doing that education and really important support work that's needed to make sure that our communities can access the ballot. And that looks like having our voter in-language voter hotlines available all election season, not just on election day. That means helping people with everything like filling out their applications for absentee ballots. That means having one-on-one phone calls to explain to people how they need to fill out those applications. That means doing everything we can to connect with voters one-on-one and help them understand that their vote is so important that we're willing to give them that personalized attention. And so that's my advice for folks in other parts of the country is don't forget why we do this work. It's about the communities, it's about our voters, it's about making sure that we can keep our right to vote and that we can make our voices heard where it hits them the most. And I think that they recognize that this next election is really gonna hit them in the worst areas possible.
Great. I just want to cut in really quick, and I've been told that we have about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to shorten the question to what is your advice for other organizers and states? So Tony, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. So I would advise other organizers in other states to continue engaging, right? So a lot like Aisha was saying, everything that we're doing goes right back to the voters and what they want. So if you are not in touch with your base, if you are not building your base out, then you're not doing the work that's going to have the impact that you're looking to have. You have to ask the questions. You have to do the deep canvases, the surveys, the voter engagement. You have to do the fun things where you give away shirts that they want to wear that look like this, right? Like that's why I'm wearing these clothes, because these are the things that we do that are just fun and exciting that can make the work a little bit easier to do. However, if you are not doing the phone banking, if you're not doing a level of deep canvassing, COVID is going to impact the way that we do that, right? So whatever is the safest whenever you see this. But if you're not doing those things, then there's something wrong, because you can't move people if you don't know what moves them. So if you're not asking them questions and then helping them build those solutions that they want and empowering them through their vote, you'll never get there. So those are the things that I would suggest that folks do.
Great, thanks. And Lauren? Couple minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Aisha and Tony covered so much of the really critical community work and talking to actual people and meeting them where they are. So I'll take a different tack, which is we are here on the eve of what's going to be the worst partisan and racial gerrymandering of our lives. Partisan gerrymandering is no longer illegal. And what that means in the South in particular, where there are large communities of color, is that there's going to be a horrible racial gerrymander that's going to disempower communities of color. And the Republicans are going to use partisan data to back it up so that it can withstand the court. This is one of the many reasons passing For the People Act is so important, to do that ban on partisan gerrymandering. But here's my point. We also are on the heels of an undercount, a census. That census data is going to inform the redistricting. And it was a historic undercount. It was a Trump operation that was mismanaged intentionally, and communities of color across the country, but definitely in the South and Georgia and across the South are going to be impacted. So let's zoom out. Where are we going to go over the next 10 years? While we're fighting this hand-to-hand combat on the democracy front, as we're organizing deeply in our communities and really coaching people through how difficult this moment is in our country, we need to be thinking about where are we going to go? Where are we going to build the new battleground? What new states and what new regions of our country and regions of states are we going to build more power for our people? And so it was exactly 10 years ago when Stacey and I said, on the heels of an undercount and with a horrible gerrymander, how are we going to build over the next 10 years? That's one of the big questions we get asked all the time. And so across the South and Southwest, where communities of color and the progressive multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition is growing, as we're doing that deep organizing and empowering our communities, we need to be thinking about what are the opportunities to build over time. There's going to be setbacks. You can use legislative sessions and elections every 2 years and every year to set realistic goals of what elections you can win locally, how you can start to narrow the gap statewide, and what legislative and other issue victories you can have, and build that out over the course of 10 years. 10 years ago, no one would have thought that the 19th would want to talk to Aisha, Tony, and I on some afternoon. Georgia was not getting attention or resources 10 years ago. So I encourage all my colleagues in tough states, whether they are in the North or South or Southwest, to think big and make it possible. We need battlegrounds all over this country. That's how we're going to change our country for the long haul while we're in this sort of real existential battle at the moment.
Great. I think that's a great place to end. I wish we didn't have to cut it off, but all right, looks like this is our time. So thanks again, all three of you. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat today.
Thank you, Mariam.
Break. Join us for a breathing, stretching, and movement session led by Jessamine Stanley, yoga instructor and body liberation advocate.
What's good, y'all? I'm Jessamine Stanley, co-founder of the Underbelly and We Go High. Let's practice a yoga posture together. Find a little space where you can spread out. You're gonna step your legs like one leg's distance apart. Turn your right foot out so that it's parallel with the long edge of your mat, and then turn your left foot so that it's parallel with the short side of your mat. Press into your right big toe, press into the back edge of your left foot. See that the heel of your right foot is coming into the arch of your left foot. Sink deep into that front knee, into that right knee. Try to line up your right knee, right ankle. We're coming into Warrior Two pose. Square your hips forward. Bring your arms out so they're parallel to the ground, and breathe. Breathe. Gaze over your front fingertips. Powerful and strong. Press into your feet, and then extend that right knee straight. Parallel your feet. We're going to do the exact same thing on the other side. So you're going to turn your left foot out, right foot, just reverse it. But you can also practice this posture seated. I'm going to come to my seat. Inhale the arms up, and then draw them out parallel to the ground. Relax the shoulders away from the ears. Come back through center. Drop your arms down. Bring your feet together. Take a moment for yourself to hold it in. You are powerful and strong, and you got this.
Thank you, Jessamine, for leading us in these important and meaningful breaks all week. I'm going to take some of these lessons with me to my regular old work days. Let's move on now to a conversation about voting rights in my home state of Texas. During a special legislative session, Texas Republicans introduced one of the nation's most restrictive voting bills. To block a vote on the measure and to advocate for federal voting protections, Texas Democrats left the state and traveled to Washington, D.C. So what happens next? Let's hear from state officials about what's at stake in Texas and around the country. Texas State Rep Nicole Collier is currently serving her fourth term representing House District 95 in Tarrant County. She's the chair of the Criminal Jurisprudence Committee and the first vice chair of the Texas Legislative Black Caucus. Judge Lina Hidalgo is the head of Harris County's governing body. Harris County is the third largest county in the nation and includes the city of Houston. To make it easier for Texans to vote in the 2020 election amidst a rising tide of COVID cases, she introduced 24-hour voting measures and drive-through voting sites. Barbara Rodriguez, the 19th State House's reporter, will lead this discussion.
Hello, and thank you to our panelists for joining us. It feels impossible to talk about voting rights in America right now without talking about Texas. For months, Republicans with majorities in the legislature have attempted to pass legislation that would restrict voting in various ways. Democrats responded by walking out of the House chamber during the regular session, preventing a final vote. They later traveled to Washington, D.C. during a special session to further prevent votes on related legislation. Representative Collier, let's start with you. Why did you feel those actions were necessary?
Well, thank you, Barbara, for having me. And it's great to be joined by Judge Hidalgo, a trailblazer in Harris County and in the state of Texas. You know, we had to take the step to leave the state of Texas and break quorum because of what was on the line. You know, the voting rights of all Texans was about to be changed drastically, making it harder to vote, not easier to vote, despite what they claim. And so what we saw is an attempt to roll back all the progress that our ancestors have made when it comes down to accessing the ballot box and your freedom to vote. So instead of staying there and letting them steamroll us and implement policies and procedures that criminalize simple mistakes and empower untrained partisan poll watchers, we decided that we were going to take our fight to Washington, D.C. to seek federal intervention. And so that's what we have done, and that's what we're looking forward to.
I want to ask more about that federal intervention as you described it, but first, Judge Hidalgo, as the top executive for Harris County, you helped oversee key decisions around voting accessibility in the most populous county in Texas. Can you tell us a little bit more about that work?
Yes, and I also am very happy to join you and just honored to share the stage with Representative Collier. I think she and her colleagues have really been an inspiration to me and to so many of us over the past few months as they've kept voting rights, democracy in the front of the public consciousness and really made sure that it's not easy for some of these folks who are trying to suppress the vote to do so. Look, from the moment I came into office, and I am the executive in the county that includes Houston, 33 other cities, part of my focus has been to try to make it easier for folks to participate. And we continued that in 2020. We tripled the number of early vote locations. We instituted drive-through voting, 24-hour voting. We functionally eliminated lines at polling locations through really smart allocation of voting machines and locations. And what we had was just a beautiful show of democracy. Record turnout amongst Democrats and Republicans, great feedback on our drive-through voting and 24-hour voting from voters of both parties. And just proof of the fact that if you open the doors to participation, to democracy, people show up. It was great. And of course, what we're seeing now is folks pandering to the extreme of one party in order to undo some of those reforms, which are frankly benefit everybody. And that's a really sad thing to see.
Well, thinking about the work that you've been doing as a local official, what was your initial reaction to the debate that was playing out in the legislature, and have those feelings evolved as time has progressed?
Something else I've been working on over the past year and a half, obviously, is the COVID response. I'm the emergency manager for Harris County. And on that, we saw the politicization of emergency response, which is tragic. I see another tragedy, and that is the politicization of democracy itself. I believe we can disagree on issues, and in fact, it's healthy for us to disagree on whatever policies, if it's transportation, if it's immigration, whatever it is, you build better policies through informed debates on the issues. but democracy itself should be above partisanship. When you have the extreme of one party saying falsely that the elections are rife with fraud, that we have to prevent cheating that doesn't exist, what they're doing is ultimately weakening people's faith in the electoral system, people's faith in democracy in Texas and in the country. And that's a really challenging place to be, and a place you can't go back from. Once you tear down that fabric of democracy and elections, it's hard to build it back up. So I was disappointed, and it was almost a sense of deja vu. And we're politicizing something that needs to be beyond politics.
Representative Collier, what has been the most difficult aspect of all of this? And I'm also then thinking about what has been, if any, the most rewarding.
Difficult. I mean, it's just basically the need, what this whole thing is, the voting, the election bills, why do we even need them? I mean, that's challenging. And so I don't see any reward in this until we get federal intervention. It's promising that the Democrats in the Texas House have stood together. And I just want to piggyback on what Judge Hidalgo was talking about. It's no secret that the Democrats are outnumbered in the Texas House. We lose votes all the time. But when you're talking about losing the access to voting, then that's where we draw the line. And that's where these bills are. And if you've paid attention to what's been happening, not only in the House, but in the Senate, you see that when they can't win voters, they change the rules. The census data has come out. People of color have grown in the state of Texas. And so a way to get around that is to change the rules and make it harder to vote. And that's what we're seeing happening across Texas, but also across our nation. So we've got to still stick together. We got to continue to stand together and against this attack on our freedom to vote, and stand up for our democracy to make sure that everyone has access to the ballot box through their voice and their vote. So, it's rewarding to see people speak up and recognize how valuable and important your vote is. But we still have challenges that lie ahead, and we still need to work to make sure we get that federal intervention.
And Judge Hidalgo, I'm curious if what has been the most difficult aspect of all of this, and if there has been any dynamic that has felt rewarding.
Something difficult is the folks that are supporting these voter suppression bills, they know what they're doing, they know, and they know that we know. It's very clear they're simply pandering to the extreme of their party. It's very clear there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud. And so it's just really sad to see the cynicism, the lengths that cynicism will take them to with a straight face pretend like there is fraud that is not there, like there's a need for bills that they know there's not a need for, and that they know damages voting in this state. That's really sad. Something positive has been just how incredibly we've been able to galvanize the community, and how certain leaders have stood up courageously. Some business leaders, for example, respected business leaders in the community, including here in Houston and Harris County, have been very firm on this, and it's not been an easy fight. I'll tell you, earlier during the legislative session, when Representative Collier was one of the key leaders in breaking quorum, everybody was saying it will be impossible for that many state legislators to get on the same page and break quorum together. It just requires too many people to be aligned. And they pulled it off. She pulled it off. I mean, that is hope. And what we should take away from that is that so many of us are doing everything we possibly can. So many people are trying to carry on the legacy of battles we thought we'd won many decades ago. And so we need that air cover from the federal government. It's absolutely urgent that Congress act on this. We owe that to the representatives that have been on the front lines, to the business leaders, to the community leaders that have been on the front lines, and to the people who have been fighting this fight for way too long.
On the conversation about congressional action, I'm curious to more directly ask you both what you feel should happen next, and what role do state policymakers then have in that conversation if the action is in Congress?
Well, here's the thing. On July 12th, when we first got to Washington, D.C., the discussion was not focused on voting rights in Washington, D.C. They were focused more on infrastructure and other issues. But when we got to Washington, D.C., it was very clear that we raised awareness, expanded the message. People were talking, not only were people talking and grassroots activists talking, but Congress was talking. And so it sparked their interest, it got the ball rolling, and they started making it a priority. And we saw movement on that bill. You know, the fact is, the trailblazing efforts of Harris County, the innovative ways that they expanded access to voting to their constituents was great. It was not, it did not promote any type of fraud. We haven't had any instances of fraud that were related to it. And so what they're trying to do is shut that down. But what we saw from those efforts was that Texas had one of the highest voter turnout rates since 1992 because of these innovative ways that Harris County thought of to reach the voters. And so we need federal action. We need them to have a pre-clearance provision. We need to have, because Texas, every decade since the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been in place, Texas has been found to violate it every single decade. And so this shows a pattern of discrimination and violation, which necessitates the need to implement a pre-clearance provision, and we need a look-back period. We need something that's model legislation across the nation, so that way every state is bound to this one this one standard. And so that's what we need to see happen at the federal level, so that way we can make sure that everyone has equal access to the ballot.
Judge Hidalgo, I'll pose the same question for you about what you expect, not just on the federal level, but the state level as well.
There have been several iterations of these bills, and I don't want anybody to think that in any way they've become more palatable. So it's different things. You know, first, one iteration of the bill was allowing poll watchers to film voters, get as close as they want to film voters as they cast their ballot. Another iteration was saying that there couldn't be voting on Sunday mornings when there's Souls to the Polls programs in Black churches. The current iteration allows, again, harassment of voters by poll watchers, but it also surrounds voting in this veil of criminality, makes it really easy for the state to pretend like there's fraud. So you can't guess what incredibly discriminatory and outrageous provisions these extreme right Texas legislators are going to come up with. And that's why it's important for there to be federal legislation that sets a standard that of course protects against fraud, but we already do that, but more broadly prevents these kind of shenanigans that take all kind of form or fashion. And if there isn't steps from the federal government, we're only going to see more of that, and it's going to take different versions, different iterations, but we know that without this being checked, we're only going to weaken democracy, and we're only going to create chaos here in Texas.
I'm thinking about the barriers here, and not just from the Republican Party, but from the Democratic Party as well. And so I'm curious to ask you both, you know, what you think your own party would have to do in terms of getting to some of the federal action that you're hoping for. And Representative, if you'd like to start.
I don't think I understand the question. Can you rephrase it?
Sure. Just Democrats, have a slim majority in Congress. And so there's a lot of talk about what is supposed to happen in terms of passing federal legislation around voting rights. And so what do you view as the barriers? And again, not just from from the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party as well?
Well, I want to, I hope that they continue to discuss legislation. My understanding is that they continue to have discussions on the measures, the issues that are important. They have to work it out. That's what I see. I think that they come together, they hash out the differences that they have on that particular bill, and then they move forward. The last time I talked to Senator Merkley, he said that there was 3 issues that they were away from working out. So, as long as they continue to discuss these issues and try to come up with some type of compromise, we can see movement. But they're still there. They're still at the table, meaning that they may be on recess, but they're still talking about this bill and trying to hash out ways to resolve it. So I'm not sure if I understood the question well, but I hope I tried to answer it as best I could.
Oh, absolutely. And Judge Hidalgo, I'll pose the same question too. Just again, the chatter, I guess more specifically about the filibuster, about whether Democrats are going to have the political will to advance legislation around voting rights if not everybody in their party is on board.
Well, we have to. We really have to. This is not like every other issue. And the rest of the folks that could make a difference have pushed that ball as far as it would go. And right now it's squarely in the court of the federal government. I mean, the state legislators continue to fight. They're not giving up. Certainly I'm not giving up. Neither is the community. But this is an issue where nobody wants to look back and remember the fights of Martin Luther King and so many civil rights heroes and say that we weren't there. All of us always say, if we'd been there, we would have marched with him, right? Well, this is the time to march with him. This is the time to march. So the federal legislators need to find that courage. It may not be convenient for some politically, but I think in the end, it's quite black and white. And I'm hopeful that enough has been done, that the dire nature, the urgency of the situation has been made clear, and that they will come through. It's happened in this fight already, that many times folks have said hope is lost, all is lost, it's over, but we've managed to come back and fight another day. And I'm hopeful that Democrats at the federal level will do what needs to be done, what they know needs to be done.
I'm also thinking a lot about lived experiences and how they motivate our actions. And I'm curious if you both could speak to your upbringing or your previous work and how that's shaped how you view the fight right now over voting rights. And Judge Hidalgo, if you could start.
For me, I grew up in Latin America. I was born in Colombia, grew up in Peru and Mexico before moving to Houston as a teenager. And my first job out of college was in Southeast Asia, working for free expression and freedom of information. And so I've been surrounded by examples of places where there isn't a full democracy, where participation is a privilege, not a right. And I recognize just how central it is to a thriving democracy, to be able to participate, to be able to have a system that people trust. So it's deeply ingrained in my heart, the importance of this issue. And that's why I care about it so deeply. And I've just seen, even in my time in government, whenever we have participation, we end up with better policies. That's just the truth of it. And disagreement is necessary. We can't have that without participation. So that's where I'm coming from.
And Representative Collier, you've been credited with really leading on the decision for the initial walkout. And so I'm particularly curious about how your lived experiences have impacted how you view the conversation over voting rights.
Well, I'll say this. My ancestors didn't pick cotton. They didn't pick peanuts. They didn't gather peanuts. And they sure didn't sit in the back of the bus just to have us lay down and allow them to trample over us. We have to pick up the baton and carry on and stand up for justice in these times of adversity. When we see the concerted efforts of those who are in power to roll back time, we have to make sure that we stand firm. And so my lived experiences as a Black woman is that I'm not going to let this happen on my watch. We have got to stand together and let the people know that even though they're trying to do everything they can to retain power, that we're going to stop and we're going to block it. And if that means that we have to go to Washington, D.C., stay in Washington, D.C., and implore Congress to act, we are going to do that. And we have done that. And we will continue to do that because we didn't come this far to just stop. We came this far, we're going to keep going and moving that needle forward to make sure that everyone has access to voting.
I'm thinking always about tangible things that people can do. And so I'm curious to ask you both about something actionable that you want people to walk away with from this conversation in terms of what they can do.
Well, definitely they need to contact their congressional representatives, let them know that there's two measures out there, the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Those are two measures out there that are under consideration, and ask Congress to pass them. Call your U.S. House of Representatives member and call your United States Senator. Let them know that we need those provisions in place for protection. And also contact your state representative and your state senator. Let them know where you stand on these measures. We're elected by the people and for the people, and the people can speak. The people can act by letting us know where they stand. Go to Austin, let them know, show up in the offices and tell them that you do not support this effort to limit your access to voting. So, definitely, and then donating to the cause, donating, find your representative and donate to them and make sure that they have, and those Democratic ones that are taking a stand, donate to them and make sure that they have the resources to expand their message. So, those are just three things that you can do. You can write, you can speak, and you can show up. And so these are things that you can do to help expand the message and raise awareness about the cause.
And Judge Hidalgo, what about you in terms of, something actionable that you want people to walk away with from this conversation?
Yeah, keep that message alive. Business leaders in particular have a particularly important role to play in this because they very much are above politics, or they're not in either party. So that means that their voice in some ways carries the broader message that this ought not be partisan. I agree with Representative Collier that we need folks to call their elected leaders and show up. And I think even in your community, for any community leaders, inform your networks about this fight. Make sure that it stays top of mind. And of course, participate. Register to vote in every election. Democracy depends on participation, and it takes some time. We're trying to make it as convenient as possible, but it is a responsibility that we have.
Given that we have just a little bit of time left, I wanted to note that a lot is going on right now, not just voting rights, but the ongoing effects of COVID-19, extreme weather, ongoing disparities. How does that impact, and this is a question for both of you, how does all of that impact your ability to focus on this important issue when there are so many simultaneous important issues that are playing out?
Of course, I'm very, very focused on the pandemic right now. I'm responsible for that as well. We're seeing the highest number of pediatric hospitalizations in Texas since the pandemic started, and most schools haven't even started yet. And I no longer have the ability to issue the public health interventions I did before. The state has stripped that power away from county executives. We have a more transmissible variant. We have a shortage in nurses. But look, we have to be able to focus on multiple issues at once. And throughout the length of this pandemic, I've had to do the pandemic and a hurricane pandemic and a freeze pandemic and voting rights, homelessness, transportation, you name it. And we're going to keep doing that. I do believe, short of the emergencies we face, of safety related issues, voting is just about as important as things get. It's at the heart of everything else. If you don't have that space for community input into the governing process, what are you doing? So, we're trying to keep the public focus there, but it does say something when Republicans at the state level, for the most part, they're focused on these antics as opposed to trying to make it safe for kids to go to school, as opposed to making sure that our hospitals don't get overwhelmed. So, we have to remind people what's important.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that. I've been walking and chewing gum since I was a little girl. And so this is no different. These are all important issues that we need to make sure that we are mindful of and that we are addressing. I will say that this is a team effort. I don't do this alone. I have a team that works with me. And so, we're all working together. So my team, which is House District 95, works with House District 90, which is another district. So we all work together to make sure that we're addressing the needs of Texans. And COVID is a very real need. My husband has already started school. He's a teacher. They've already started school back in this school district. And so, yes, parents are very concerned about sending their students back when the governor has tied the hands of administration that would prevent them from providing safety measures in their own community. So yes, we are addressing these issues. We're talking with the Texas Department of Emergency Management. We're talking with other health and safety, health and safety officials to make sure that we can address this. People still have concerns about their rent. Paying rent is still a very real concern for people. Thank goodness the federal government stepped in and provided the extension of the eviction moratorium for most people, but we still have those issues that are in play. So we're going to continue to address the issues with our power grid to make sure that we have real reform and real infrastructure measures in place, and making sure that we take care of our retired teachers. I'll say this, Democrats have always made sure that our retired teachers, we filed bills, have been taken care of. We filed bills. In fact, the 13th check was filed and heard in a Democratic committee this last session, and it passed, but it died in a Republican calendar committee. So we will continue to press forward on these issues that impact Texans, that have a true interest, that Texans really have an interest in, and moving them forward. And we'll work together because it is a team effort.
Our time has run out. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
While Georgia and Texas have seen efforts to curb voting rights, states like Kentucky, Vermont, Oklahoma, and Virginia have actually expanded voting access through both partisan and bipartisan measures. We're going to turn to leaders in Virginia to learn how they accomplished that. State Delegate Marcia Sia Price is serving her third term representing the 95th District in the Virginia House of Delegates. She was the co-sponsor of the Voting Rights Act of Virginia that aims to eliminate racial inequities in voting. Tram Nguyen is the co-founder and co-executive director of the New Virginia Majority, which engages young people and people of color with state-level politics. Under her leadership, New Virginia Majority has registered more than 300,000 Virginians to vote. Candace Norwood, the 19th's breaking news reporter, will moderate this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for being here with me today and for speaking about this very important issue of voting rights, and specifically voting rights in Virginia. Now, Virginia is a state that has historically had issues and have received criticism for barriers for voting access for Black voters and voters of color. But in recent years, a number of pieces of legislation have been passed to expand voting access for people. One of those pieces of legislation is the Virginia Voting Rights Act, which is mirrored after the 1965 Federal Voting Rights Act. And to set the stage for our audience, I want to talk a little bit about that 1965 Voting Rights Act, which barred racial discrimination in voting. But in 2013, the Supreme Court removed key parts of that legislation. So to start off, Delegate Price, I want to ask you, can you talk a little bit about what that 2013 Supreme Court decision covered and how it affected the Federal Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, so thank you. It's really important that states do the right thing, and states weren't doing the right thing on their own. And so the 1965 Voting Rights Act had a provision in it such that those localities that had a history of voter suppression had to put their changes and laws through a pre-clearance process. And so basically the federal government had to okay the changes that they were making because a lot of them were making the wrong decisions. And so that was what was gutted in the 2013 case, and also the focus of, I guess what a lot of people would say was the meat of, a lot of what we needed in order to protect voters. So it really just weakened what the 1965 Voting Rights Act was able to do nationally.
And Tram, can you talk a little bit about how that decision in 2013 from the Supreme Court affected voting access for people of color?
Sure. So that 2013, in the Shelby v. Holder case, right, what it essentially did was it basically eliminated the requirement for pre-clearance, as Delegate Price mentioned. And so for voters of color, for Virginia, for example, right, we were under those pre-clearance requirements because we were a state in the South that had a history of discriminating against Black voters in particular. And then it sort of transformed into, discriminating against all voters of color. And so without that pre-clearance requirement, so in 2013, Virginia passed a strict photo ID provision. And before the Shelby v. Holder case, it would have had to be pre-cleared. And the Department of Justice would have reviewed that to see if it had a disproportionate impact on voters of color. What Virginia did when they passed that act in 2013, which they passed before the Shelby v. Holder decision came down, was they had a delayed enactment. And so the Shelby v. Holder decision came down, the law was passed, but because of the delayed enactment, and when Shelby v. Holder basically eliminated that pre-clearance requirement, Virginia was able to enact that strict photo ID provision without any review, right? And so what happened, and I will never forget, Miss Augustine Carter, a 90-year-old Black woman who was born and raised in Virginia, who did not have a birth certificate, who went to the DMV with her 1940 census record, because that was the only record she had that would validate who she was not able to get an ID, right? Those are the folks that these laws basically strip their right to vote away. And so these decisions that are being made in our court system are significant. You look at what happened a couple of weeks ago in another case, in the Arizona case, where the Supreme Court basically, with their decision, is making it really hard for us to even challenge the voter suppression laws that are being enacted across the country for review of racial discrimination. The Section 2 requirements of the Federal Voting Rights Act are essentially now, being undermined. And so the right to vote, as sacred as it is 100% under attack. And why we in Virginia have tried so hard to sort of reverse that course, and why Delegate Price and her leadership on the Voting Rights Act of Virginia is intended to sort of replace some of those provisions that we've lost.
Now, Tram, just 3 years ago, Virginia was ranked 49th in the country for voting access, and that reputation has changed as it's being seen as a leader on this issue. Now, can you walk me through a little bit about what were the challenges historically with voting access in Virginia and how that has shifted in recent years?
Virginia, as much as people don't want to consider Virginia as part of the South, and with the legacy of the South and Jim Crow, like that is our reality. We have unfortunately always made it difficult for folks to participate, despite sort of wanting to be this bastion of democracy and our founding fathers and the original House of Burgesses and all of that. that wasn't for people like us, right? That was for a certain class of folks. And so in Virginia, we had like, again, the strict photo ID requirements that, you know, stopped a Miss Carter from being able to vote. We had restrictions on whether or not you can vote absentee. You had to provide an excuse that you know, basically validated your need to be able to vote by mail or to vote early before election day. And it was, I mean, they were very specific excuses. If you were going to be away from your home county for 13 hours because you had to commute and you had to like do all this math. And I'm like, well, am I going to be away for 13 hours? Well, maybe I'm only going to be away for 11 and a half hours. Or I don't know how traffic's going to be that day. So am I going to be able to vote absentee like a week before? And so it's like these little things, right? Death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Where it's like in the aggregate, it makes it really hard for us to vote. And so, yeah, 3 years ago in 2018, we were 49th in the country with access to voting. We were that hard. And so the reversal over the last 2-3 years has just been, I mean, transformational.
Yeah, and I would just like to add even further back, right? So Senator Jen McClellan and I were the sponsors of the Voting Rights Act of Virginia. And she tells the story of her grandfather having to go through a literacy test. And my grandfather had to pay poll taxes. And so it's this consistent history, like Tram said, that, you know, we were where it all started ostensibly, right? And so not forgetting where a lot of the 400-year history, where, you know, it was illegal for Black folks to even own books. So of course it was a literacy test. It was, you know, we didn't have a lot of resources. So of course it was a poll tax, right? So it was these intentional attacks on access. And we had that history within our lived experiences through the family. And I just also grew up with that knowledge, but also with the inspiration of people like Evelyn Butts out of Norfolk, Virginia, whose Supreme Court case actually ended poll taxes. And so I was the one that got to carry stripping that the vestiges of that language out of the Virginia Code in 2020. So there's this deep connection, but there's also a connection to the history of those that have been fighting for their rights and fighting for access. And so I think that's what's inspiring for us to keep going and why we were able to be a group of women of color fighting for this and actually getting it over the finish line.
Yeah, and Delegate Price, you and Tram's organization, the New Virginia Majority, have both played a role in getting the new voting rights legislation passed in Virginia. And can you talk about kind of how that legislation came together and why you feel it's important?
Yeah, so last year there was a bill that was trying to reinstitute the pre-clearance part, and it was really targeting those localities that, of course, had the history. And so it didn't quite get over the finish line, and we had been thinking about something a little bit more comprehensive. So we said, go big or go home. And so we got the best minds in the business around the table. Of course, Tram, what Tram brings to the table with New Virginia Majority is having knocked over 1 million doors in 2020. And with that is 1 million conversations. And so what are some of the obstacles that people are seeing? And it's not apathy. It is a definite understanding of the system is too hard to navigate. And I don't want to be a part of something that's going to disenfranchise me. And so, okay, we've got to open this up so that everybody feels welcome in order to vote. Or what were some of the issues that they cared about the most? And whether they use the same words as the industry or not, it was always about being able to participate in democracy and it be fair. And so then we brought in some amazing and brilliant lawyers who were on the front lines of litigation against the bad bills that were happening in other areas. So we had the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, we had the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law with their voting rights program, and we also had Advancement Project here at the table. And so that's when we got together. Okay, we knew what was happening in Virginia because we had those 1 million conversations. We knew what historically was happening legally because you had Senator McClellan and me knowing about the legislation. And then we also got to hear stories of what was happening across the country so that we could react to what was happening in Virginia and then be proactive against some of the things that we were hearing out of other parts of the country. And that's where we landed and why it is not only the first Southern state to have its own Voting Rights Act, but we think also the most comprehensive that exists and a model for other states to really look at how do we attack this from all angles to make voting truly available to all voters.
Now, Delegate Price, can you also talk about some of the provisions that might mirror the original 1965 Voting Rights Act and some that might differ or expand on that legislation?
Yeah, so I think we really went after the intent of it, but where there were pre-clearance provisions that were kind of targeting the folks that had the historic track record of voter suppression, we wanted all of Virginia voters to be protected under these provisions. And so it is really transparency and a collaborative effort, as we see it, where elections officials and the people that will be impacted by their decisions can work together. So there is a public comment period for any of the changes that should be made in those covered practices, say for instance, changing a polling place. And so the public that would be impacted by that, the voters in those precincts, would be able to comment. And that was really important for, say, there was an instance in Richmond where a polling place that is well known. It was an early voting location, well known, easily accessible, right by a bus stop, was actually moved to completely in the cut. Like you had to walk, I think, a mile from a bus stop to get there. People didn't know where it was, and a lot of people didn't know it had moved. That is not good in order for us to open this voting process up. So that change would have had to go through a public comment period and then also a public waiting period to allow for the assessment of the impact on the protected classes to be measured. And so that's one, and that's for all of Virginia. And then also too, there's a language access requirement on federal elections. We put that language access requirement on state and local elections because if you can do it and have access to the language help that you need in order to vote for president, then it should also be there when you're voting for governor or for mayor. And so so we match that up. And then I think one of the larger parts that we had to discuss and kind of work around was the fact that now an affected voter, potentially affected voter, or the attorney general can sue should that I almost said pre-clearance, but should that pre-process go wrong and something actually dilute the vote of African Americans, voters of color, or there be voter suppression on the back end, they can sue. We also wanted to make sure that if there are local elections that are going from, say, like a ward system to at-large voting, that process cannot dilute the voting block or power of the voters of color. And lastly, we set up a voter education and outreach fund. Should any of these court cases be successful, the funds would go into that, but we also procured $400,000 of funding for that. And we're also right now in special session working on trying to get even more funding there because there have been so many changes to open up the voting process. We want people to know their rights and what's available to them.
Tram, in addition to this Voting Rights Act in Virginia, over the last year and a half, the state has also passed a number of other election and voting related changes, including repealing the voter ID law and instituting 45 days of no excuse absentee voting. Can you talk about why some of these different changes are important for voters?
First of all, I'll just say every time I hear Delegate Price talk about the Voting Rights Act, it like the policy nerd in me, it's like it's singing to my soul. It's like, oh my gosh, we did do all of that. It's breathtaking. So thank you, Delegate Price, for your leadership on that. And yeah, I mean, we have done a lot, right, to move Virginia from 49th in the country 3 years ago to 12th after our 2020 legislative session. And I dare say that when that study comes back out and they look at everything else we did in 2021, including the Voting Rights Act, I would be surprised if we were not the top 5, if not like #1. So like that's it, and it's amazing. And it is doing things like repealing the strict photo ID law, opening it up for 45 days of access to voting, right? Making sure that those excuses are eliminated so that you can choose the method of voting that is most convenient for you, whether that is in person on election day, whether that it's in person before election day when you're on your way to work or on your way to school or some, family gathering, or if you want to vote in the safety of your home. We are still in the middle of a pandemic, right? And it's important for folks to be able to not have their access to voting restricted because of a health concern or because they're worried for the safety of their families, right? So be able to vote by mail at a time that's convenient for them. So we did all that. We have made drop boxes available. And so if you don't want to put your ballot in the mail or put a stamp on it and send it out away, you can just roll on up and drop it in a secure drop box, and that's going to be collected by folks. We have made Sunday voting optional, and I think a lot of localities are about to take the state up on that, which is going to be amazing. We have pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. We're about to have same-day voter registration. So, oftentimes when I man the phones on election day and voters are calling in with, some questions or concerns, the number one issue that pops up is, I just showed up to vote and my name's not on the roll, but I swear that I changed my voter registration and updated it to this address, but it's not showing up. And it's because of some administrative error, right? That they moved recently and their records weren't updated. So they're not showing up on that precincts list, but they are registered to vote, right? And in order for their vote to count, they'd have to go back to their original precinct, where they moved from. And for some people, that's across the state. And so now with same day voter registration, they could update their record right then and there, right? Or, and they just moved and they can register for the first time in the state and be able to cast a ballot. So we have done all of these things to expand the right to vote in Virginia. We're bucking the trend across the country. We're seeing voter suppression happen in many, many places across the country, but right here in Virginia, we are 100% bucking that trend. And while I'm proud of that, I'm very, very proud of that. I also recognize that we can't just pat ourselves on the back, right, and say we're done, because the right to vote in this country should not depend on where we live, should not depend on our zip code, what state we reside in, and that we need to do more collectively, working with our allies and our partners in Georgia and Arizona and Florida and Texas and say, no, the time is now. We need to pass comprehensive voting rights legislation in Congress. Yes, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been decimated, but we can do better, right? We can do better with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, with the For the People Act, and now a Voting Rights Act that was just introduced also in Congress. And so there's a lot of work we have to do together. And I am, like I said, 100% proud of the work that we've done in Virginia, but it is not enough. And I'm ready to, roll up my sleeves and do the work with all of our partners and our fellow travelers in this civil rights journey.
And if I could just add, Trim did an amazing job of going through a lot of the campaign stuff, but she was also involved with the work that we did on the larger picture of democracy, which I think is really important too. And we did work on redistricting reform, and we were able to pass a bill that made political, racial, and prison gerrymandering illegal. So even before voters show up to vote, that redistricting process, what the lines look like, who is able to, vote for whom, that is such an important part of the groundwork. And that is still part of democracy and what we've been able to do. And our partners were really, really there for us. Senator McClellan and I worked on that as well together, and we were able to get that passed. And so globally, Virginia might have disagreed on who gets to do the drawing, and now we have a commission, so we can talk about the pros and cons of a commission or how better to go about a commission than what Virginia did. But the laws that they'll have to follow in drawing that really do make a headway for political prison and racial gerrymandering. And so I think when we look at like Texas, those legislators that were in DC talking about, hey, you may not know just how bad it is in Texas, and to put juxtapose West Virginia against Texas so that lawmakers truly understand what Virginia is also doing is showing how far you can actually go once you strip down the obstacles to truly make it open and available for everyone. And so I think we're proud of that, but definitely committed to the work to making sure that this is a national endeavor.
And Tram, what would you say to organizers who in other states who may want to replicate some of the things that Virginia has done?
I would say just do it, right? I think we are all so used to, especially in this particular moment, used to playing defense, right? Our democracy is under attack. So we are like, guard up, let's defend, right? And we should absolutely defend against all of this wave of voter suppression efforts and all of these laws that are being proposed. At the same time, we need to be prepared to go on offense, right? And so I've been asked recently, how did you just in 3 years just completely, do a complete reversal, a complete 180? And it's because we weren't starting from scratch. We have been playing that offense. We have been putting in, while folks were putting in voter suppression bills and enacting them in Virginia, we were also putting in the proactive policies to expand the right to vote. And while they didn't pass, right? I mean, God bless those 7 a.m. committee meetings that I had to go to every week during session was just, I can't even describe it. It was just like so maddening and so depressing at the same time because they would die. But by the time we had the political conditions to actually pass all of those laws, we were not starting from scratch because we knew that we had the people behind us because of all of those conversations we've been having in the community, that they wanted to be supportive of this proactive democracy agenda. We had the legislators on board in terms of, already doing the legwork, already filing the bills, drafting the bills. We had the votes. We had stakeholders, legal experts that were ready to go so that we weren't again, I think across the country, we need to be able to not only fight back against the voter suppression efforts, but also to imagine what's possible, right? To imagine what's possible and lay the groundwork brick by brick to make sure that we can have this expansive voting rights in Georgia. We can have this expansive voting rights in Texas and frankly, across the country, because as Americans, we deserve this. This is, our democracy, our right to vote is at the heart of what it means to be an American. And this is what we're fighting for.
Now, Delegate Price, another issue, voting issue that took place this year in terms of changes was that Governor Ralph Northam signed an executive order to extend the right to vote, restore the right to vote to about 69,000 people who have been convicted of felonies and to give them the right to vote again. Previously, Virginia had been one of just 3 states that permanently disenfranchised people convicted of felonies. But this change is not currently cemented in the Constitution, the state Constitution, correct? So could you talk a bit about what the difference is between making this change in an executive order form and actually making the change in the Constitution?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's back up. There was a law that was put in for us to be able to change the Constitution. And before that even happened, it was organizers and activists that got us to the point that we had the political will and courage to pass it. So there's been a lot of work in reentry with residents that are just really hell-bent on making sure that everyone is able to exercise their right. And so that built the pressure. So then we had the law. In Virginia, in order to change the Constitution, you have to pass the law, the resolution changing it through one General Assembly. There has to be an election, and then you pass it through that new General Assembly. Then it goes to the voters by referendum in that November. And so what we've gotten passed is that first go round that we got it passed. So then we're about to have an election. We need to get it passed again. And then it goes to the voters, who overwhelmingly say that if you have been, free, that you should get your right back to vote automatically. And we've also been able to have a larger conversation as to whether or not you should ever lose that right or not. not, but specifically this is automatic voter restoration, voter rights restoration. And so I think what the governor and his people saw was that there was so much energy behind it, and knowing that that process was going to take a little bit longer, that they stepped up and did the executive order so that those 69,000 could be re-enfranchised now and moving forward, because we know that executive orders do not last beyond their administration. And so we're on our way to having it be a constitutional change, but elections matter, and there have to be people that will continue to make this a campaign issue to keep people to their word that said, yes, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to pass this again. So then the voters have that chance to do it again, or elect a governor that would do another executive order. But it's really important that that we keep the pressure on and get this done.
And Tram, it's one thing to have laws and protections in place, right? But implementation and making sure that things are implemented equitably can still be a challenge, even with laws in place. I mean, with all of these different things that we've talked about, what do you feel needs to take place outside of the legislative process to ensure that people are getting the access?
Candace, I love that you asked that question, because many, many times people will say, we passed it, we passed the law, we are done, and they move on to the next thing. But you hit the nail on the head. The implementation side is equally important, right? Because you could put something on the books, but if it's implemented wrong, or if it's not implemented at all, then you're actually not making the impact that you think you've made. I think about, look at Florida when they did their rights restoration, their right to vote ballot measure, right, to restore the voting rights of the returning citizens. They passed it, overwhelming. Floridians passed it. And then it came to implementation. And the administration in Florida said, nope, we're gonna put all of these other barriers in place. You're gonna have to pay back fines and fees in order to even qualify. And so yes, the implementation side is super important. And I think that's where we can't let up. It's continuing to hold folks who are making these decisions around how to implement laws, whether it's the administration or the agencies, being a part of that process, right? Continuing to monitor, observe, provide public comment when they're in regulatory hearings. But at the end of the day, it's about average, everyday people exercising our right to vote and showing that we are here, we're not going away, and we're holding you accountable, whether you're an elected office or not, and we're paying attention, right? And because the right to vote, then, when we're making our voices heard and we're exercising our right to vote, then all of those other issues that we care about, whether it's access to public health, health care, whether it's access to public education, whether it's having good paying jobs and having family leave and medical leave, like those things are not going to matter if we don't have our right to vote in order to hold our elected officials accountable. So everything is interconnected. Elections are never the finish line. Passing laws are never the finish line. Implementation is actually never the finish line, because once we implement, it's like, oh, we didn't think about this when we passed the law. So we got to go back to the General Assembly and say, we got to fix this, right? And so it's just this constant body of work that we all need to engage in. And in some ways, it's just reflective of America, right? Like our Constitution is a living document that is supposed to adapt to the challenges and the conditions of our current moment. And that's what this democratic process is all about, right? It's that we are continuing to be better, continuing to move our state and our country forward. And that requires all of us to be involved every step of the way.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for being here and speaking with me, and good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
And thank you to all the community leaders in Georgia, Texas, and Virginia for sharing your work and stories with us. Now, how about a song? The Linda Lindas are a punk and power pop band who rose to fame with viral videos and appearances in the movie Moxie. They are a group of 4 Asian and Latinx teens who have been performing together since 2018. Mila, 10, Eloise, 13, Lucia, 14, and Bella, 16, are 2 sisters, a cousin, and their close friend. Linda Lindas, take it away.
Hi, we're the Linda Lindas. Thanks to the 19th for inviting us to play. We're really happy to support. This is a song called Missing You that I wrote last summer. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sunlight comes streaming in through my window. Green leaves all dance in the breeze, but I'm just stuck in my house all day long. I can't go and do what I please. Yeah, I could FaceTime or do homework online, but it just ain't the same. I wanna see my friends and play with my band. I wanna eat dinner at my grandma's place. Here I sit in my house feeling so blue. I'm missing you. I see the birds fly outside my window. I see the squirrels scamper by, but I just I hear them, I've been looking at them. They play outside, why can't I? Yeah, I could FaceTime or do homework online, but it just ain't the same. I wanna go to shows, watch baseball, eat nachos. I wanna garden at my grandma's place. Here I sit in my house feeling so blue. I'm missing you. You know I have time to learn to crochet, reading books all day long, and making noodles to stuff my face. Even writing me songs, 'cause I could FaceTime or do homework online, but it just isn't the same. I wanna see my friends and play with my band. I wanna eat dinner at my grandma's place. Here I sit in my house feeling so blue. I'm missing you. Here I sit in my house singing to you. We'll make it through.
That was an amazing performance. Thank you so much. For our final keynote, we're going to zoom out from the state level and talk to one of the nation's leading civil and voting rights advocates, Sherrilyn Ifill. We'll hear how civil rights leaders are mobilizing at the state and national levels and what's next in the modern-day fight for equal access to the ballot box. Sherrilyn Ifill is the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. In that role, she fights against racial disparities and limits on participation in our democracy. Erin Haynes, the 19th's editor-at-large, will lead this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Emily. And Sherrilyn, thank you, because there's really nobody that I wanted to talk to more in today's conversation about the future of voting rights in this country. We've talked so much in our first year at the 19th about this issue with you. So thank you for your insights today and every day, because they have truly strengthened my reporting.
Thank you so much, Erin. I am so honored to be here and just love the work of the 19th. And this is a period of time in which there is no more important conversation than the one that we can have about voting rights and the future of democracy in this country.
Yeah, well, we 100% agree with that at the 19th. So I guess with that, let's get started. I mean, it is August. Congress still has not passed a bill protecting voting rights at the federal level. I want to start by asking kind of where would you say that things stand in terms of the federal legislation on this issue? And what are the stakes if Congress does not act?
I have said that failure is not an option because the stakes are so high. We are really at a critical moment. You know, I often say that January 6th, you know, our democracy almost went over the cliff. It didn't go over the cliff, but we are still at the cliff's edge. And January 7th, the day after, the day that actually the votes were finally fully received in Congress, and Vice President Harris and President Biden now were officially elected. That was the day that Georgia announced the creation of a new election integrity commission, and it has been off to the races ever since. The voter suppression that we have seen over the last few months is in direct response to the extraordinary mobilization of voters that happened last year and the turnout. It's in direct response to the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. It's in direct response to the outcome of the special election in the Senate in Georgia. And so what we're seeing is a concerted effort to make sure that what happened in 2020 and in January in that special election never happens again. And look, I'm a voting rights litigator. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the organization I lead, has been in this fight and in this battle since Thurgood Marshall won the case ending the all-white primary in 1944. But I can tell you, we cannot litigate our way out of this one. We are playing whack-a-mole. Litigation will not do it alone. Organizing can't do it alone. We need this legislation. And so the same pitch I'm making to you, I have made to members of Congress, including Senator Manchin, including Republicans. It's that serious, including the President of the United States.
Yeah. I mean, this month also marks the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And we know in the courts, the Supreme Court's most recent decision is further defanging the Voting Rights Act. Talk about that. I mean, with Section 2 now on the line, Section 5 already gone with the Shelby versus Holder decision in 2013. Where do things stand now with voter protection at the federal level?
Well, I used to say that I thought that the Shelby County versus Holder decision, the June 2013 decision that left Section 5 in place, but turned it into a shell by removing Section 4, which was the formula that covered jurisdictions that had to submit any voting changes they wanted to make to a federal authority before they were enacted. And it was widely regarded as the most successful civil rights statutory mechanism ever created because it allowed us to stop discrimination before it happened. And when that decision came down in June 2013, I thought it was the worst voting rights decision that we had seen in a century until the Brnovich decision this July, that essentially was so audacious in its attack on Section 2. What it revealed also is a kind of terrifying cynicism among a majority of the justices on this court. Remember, in the Shelby County decision, when the court decided to kind of remove the power to take the formula away from Section 5, one of the things they said in that decision is that, the Voting Rights Act still exists, it's still strong, you still have Section 2. And then in the Brnovich decision this July, in a decision written by Justice Alito, there's a kind of careless disregard really for Congress. And I have shared this with members of Congress. They should be even more outraged than I am because the liberties that Justice Alito takes and the willingness of other justices like Justice Gorsuch, who purport to be textualists, to ignore the text of Section 2 and to create their own test to countermand the test for evaluating cases under Section 2 that Congress created was a particularly audacious move. I mean, even in Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court said, Congress can come back and make a formula, but it needs to be more updated. In Brnovich, they didn't even turn it back over to Congress. They said, we're going to create the test, all the while saying this is not really a test. It's just a guideline. It's just a suggestion. It's a test, and they were prepared to create it themselves.
Yeah, well, you're making such a good point here because, Section 2 was, kind of the more proactive part of the Voting Rights Act, and the Department of Justice, this Department of Justice has renewed its commitment to protecting voters, has taken kind of that more proactive approach using Section 2 to the issue. They've already filed a lawsuit against Georgia, where I'm from, for its voter suppression law that they passed earlier this year that's already on the books. I know Vanita Gupta and Kristen Clark, but can you talk for our audience about their roles and the Department of Justice, what the DOJ is able to do, especially in the wake of this Supreme Court decision, and why they matter as part of this fight?
Well, they matter for the reason I suggested at the top, which is that, you know, we're playing whack-a-mole. These voter suppression laws are coming fast and furious. We filed suit against the Georgia law within a week or 10 days of its enactment. We filed suit against Florida's voter suppression law. We'll see what's going to happen with Texas. You know, our eyes are laser focused on Southern jurisdictions passing these laws, and I don't think that it's over. I think we should expect more to happen. So we need DOJ's resources to bring to these cases. When they filed suit in Georgia, that was the 8th group that was, you know, litigating against that voter suppression law. I want to see them come out earlier. I want to see them, you know, really be prepared to lead in a number of these jurisdictions. But with regard to Section 2, they're in the same position we're in, because they also have to now litigate these cases under this new framework that Justice Alito has advanced, that is utterly divorced from the text of Section 2 and that seeks to solve a problem that doesn't exist. I started out, Erin, as a voting rights attorney at LDF, the organization I now lead, in 1988. I litigated Section 2 cases. Our organization litigates Section 2 cases involving both vote dilution and vote denial. We successfully challenged the restrictive Texas voter ID law under Section 2. We had no problem applying the test that Congress created. And yet Justice Alito in the Brnovich case decides to create a new test for vote denial cases. And the Justice Department is going to have to grapple with Brnovich just as much as private civil rights litigators will have to do so. So they're in a tough spot as well, but they have the resources, the expanded legal team. I've also remind people that there are more sections to the Voting Rights Act. There's Section 11B. We're actually suing under that section right now. You know, there's sections that prevent conspiracies against voting. There's Section 230. You know, there's language minority materials. So we've got to use the whole statute. And then we've got to use the other statutes that are available to us. We've got to use the Help America Vote Act. We've got to use the Motor Voter Law. We've got to use the Americans with Disability Act, where there are voter suppression means that undermine access for members of the disability community. So we've got to use everything available to us, and the Justice Department is in that same position.
You see, this is why I love talking to you, because I always learn something. Clearly, my homework heading out of this week is to get much more familiar with the entirety of the Voting Rights Act, because I don't know that enough of us as political journalists and students of history have that context and really have that knowledge. You know, you talked about, you know, the fact that you have been in this fight for a long time. And I want to try to get to what maybe feels different about this fight now. Fighting discrimination through the courts, as you mentioned, has been historically effective at dismantling systemic inequality in many areas. But talk a little bit about that history and kind of what, if anything, feels different to you now. I know for me on voting rights, you know, before it seemed like it was about, you know, trying to keep people from the ballot box, but now it feels like, you know, even if people are able to successfully cast a ballot, overcome these many obstacles, negating that vote on the back end feels like something that is a new strategy in the 21st century voter suppression effort. So yeah, talk a little bit about all of that.
Erin, that's spot on. One of the things we were very clear about in our early discussions with the new team at the Justice Department in the Biden administration was that the voting section was going to have to expand its thinking about intervention around voter suppression, because most of us who litigated voting rights cases traditionally, you know, we're focused on the front end. We were focused on access to registration. Then we were focused on access to voting on election day. But for the most part, in my my career as a young lawyer at LDF litigating voting rights cases, I never had a case where I worried about the counting of the ballots, right? And whether there was going to be some subversion of the count. But now we see that has become kind of standardized, right? And so, you know, you saw it after the 2020 election with Trump. We actually filed suit against Trump and then later added the RNC, and that suit is still live. You know, based on that effort to try to undermine the vote. And what's interesting about it, you were talking about, you know, getting familiar with the Voting Rights Act. What we had to really share with people is how the Voting Rights Act defines voting when it protects against discriminatory voting practices. It defines voting not only as the casting, but it also says the counting and the accurate adding of that vote to the tally, right? So it goes the protection goes all the way through. And I think now we realize we have to put more resources to this back end, to making sure that votes are actually counted, that they're accurately counted, and that they're added to the appropriate tally for the candidates that minority voters voted for. But what we're seeing in the states, like in Georgia, is a provision added to their voter suppression bill really within the last 48, 72 hours before the bill was enacted, was this provision that removes the power from local election officials to be able to decide which votes are disqualified and which are not, removing that power from the Secretary of State, remembering Brad Raffensperger, despite being a Republican, standing against Trump's effort to try to subvert the election in Georgia. And now that power really rests with the partisan legislature, who will appoint people who will be making those decisions. So we're in a pickle, because that back end piece is really their insurance. It's essentially saying, if we haven't been able to suppress the vote through all of these various schemes, if we haven't been able to discourage people from voting by saying you can't give them water or food if they're standing on a 9-hour line in Fulton County, as voters did last year in the primary, if we haven't been able to change the polling places and confuse people, if we haven't been able to do any of that, and they've mobilized and they've turned out and they've cast their ballots, they kept some insurance on the back end to ensure that if necessary, they have the opportunity to subvert and steal an election. It's that serious. We are talking about things that directly confront and undermine any notion of democracy and fairness. So we're still in an incredibly critical moment. And that's why we need all the resources. We need the private bar, we need the activists who are mobilizing, we need the Justice Department, we need it all. But we need the legislation first and foremost at this moment.
Yeah, I think part of this 21st century effort also is the erosion in voter confidence that you alluded to, right? I mean, the big lie did not succeed in President Trump getting reelected, but the big lie is alive and well in terms of the idea of a rigged election, election fraud, the need to guard against this false threat against election integrity. Talk to me about the big lie and its continuing to be harmful to our democracy and to our electorate.
I wish there were just one big lie, but there have been so many in the voting space. You'll remember that when COVID struck, beginning in March or April of 2020 is when suddenly President Trump started to post, he was at that point still on Twitter, all these tweets about the ways in which absentee voting, right, was a stalking horse for voter fraud, that it was dangerous, that it was illegal. Riling up people in Michigan about absentee voting, riling up people in California about absentee voting. So there was a drumbeat of lies about the voting process that was being advanced by President Trump, and at that time he had full access to the most important social media platforms. So there was already the sowing of doubt around this idea of fraud in the election. Quite deliberately, this was a hedge against the possibility that he would lose, and he did lose. And then the building of this fraud narrative, the stop the steal. What happened on January 6th? The refusal to accept the reality of the loss of this election. 70 million people in the country being willing to be held hostage, and their vision of democracy and their sense of freedom in our country being held hostage to one man's ego. It's incredibly frightening. I mean, we've seen things like this happen around the world. So it's not just one lie, it's many lies. And it's the former president having groomed essentially millions of people to accept whatever lie and whatever narrative he's advancing. And now people do it on their own. It doesn't require Trump anymore, actually, to keep it going. Think about what's happening in Arizona. Words like audit are being discredited. Now you would think that an audit would be the thing we would need to restore confidence in voting, but now the very word has been undermined and distorted by the shenanigans taking place in Arizona and other places in the country. So there is a concerted effort to make voters feel that the process is rigged, that it can't be fixed, that it is by its nature fraudulent. That is all to disengage us from the project of democracy, to have us throw up our hands and believe that there's nothing that we can do. And it's going to require a tremendous amount of discipline for all of us to stand against that, to resist that, and to understand that as much as we need the legislation, we need to push back against these narratives.
Yeah. Well, Sherrilyn, you keep mentioning all of us, and that reminds me of something that you and I talk about quite a bit. You talked to me about the importance of an inside-outside strategy for the battle against voter suppression. Can you explain what you mean by that to our audience? Because I think it's such a good point that you make. And what, I guess to that end, is the Legal Defense Fund's role in that battle? How are you specifically playing a role from the outside?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no civil rights progress has ever been made in this country without a full complement of tools being brought to bear to make pressure for change. And at LDF, we use all those tools. We use litigation. We use our policy work. We're pushing on the Hill and talking about, right now, how you fix the Brnovich case with legislators. We're at the White House explaining to the president and sharing with the president our view about the state of emergency that we're in, and why we cannot allow a Senate rule like the filibuster to hold hostage the right of Black people to vote and participate in the political process. We're in the meetings with Manchin. We asked, along with other civil rights groups from Manchin, to bring the Republicans, and so we met with 13 Republicans and made our arguments. But we're also doing the narrative work. That's why I'm talking to you now. That's why you see me out there, not because I like seeing my face on Zoom, but because we have to talk to people about what is happening, and we have to be prepared with information to undercut the false narratives that are being advanced. And then we also have to ensure that we undergird those who are out engaging in mobilization and activism. We have organizers on our staff who are out in communities talking directly to people about the consequences, providing support where we can. We have a voting rights defender project that monitors elections, at the polling place throughout the South. Every election, we'll be out this year because, my mantra has been local elections also matter. And so we don't just come out every 4 years for the presidential election. We don't just come out every 2 years for federal elections. We're out every year because we understand that Black people also need to be able to influence who, prevails in the city council race, who prevails in the prosecutor race, who prevails in the school board race. Look at everything that's happening right now around these so-called anti-CRT measures, but that are actually measures designed to keep teachers throughout the country from teaching the truth about the history of racism and inequity in this country. So school board elections matter. And so we're out, on the ground when we can be. Obviously, COVID, makes that difficult. But when we can't be on the ground, we have apps that allow us to monitor what's happening at the polls. We train local poll watchers in multiple states every year who can be there on the scene. And we're involved in troubleshooting in real time when there are problems that happen at the polls, when a polling place is changed, when it's closed too early, when they don't have the power cords, when the lines are too long, when we see voter intimidation like we saw last year. We are on the phone with the Attorney General of that state that day. We are on the phone with the Department of Justice saying this is what is happening in XYZ state. So we're doing all that full 360 of what you have to do to be able to make change happen. And so you have to be willing to talk to the president, but you also have to stand outside and tell the president from the outside what has to happen. You have to stand with your people and say, this is what we want and what we demand. And so we try to use all the tools that are available to us to try to make change happen. There is no way that we can put all our eggs in one basket and think that we are going to be able to deal with the tsunami of discrimination that is happening in this country at this moment. Whether it's in the voting context or in any other context. So everyone has to be prepared to understand the nature of the battle that we are in. This is as serious as anything that was faced in the civil rights movement. And in some ways, it is more serious because what was largely regional in its most extreme forms has metastasized. What we saw happening at the State House in Michigan last year with folks at the State House with guns, the threats to the governor, the plan to kidnap the governor, that was Michigan. That wasn't Alabama. So we're now talking about a national effort to subvert democracy. And it's going to require all of us to get very serious about what is happening and what's being required of us if we hope to push back against it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I know that you are pressing on the Biden-Harris administration, and I want to shift to them because I know that reports said that they suggested a strategy of out-organizing voter suppression, and they got a lot of backlash. For the comment, you talked about not being able to out-legislate voter suppression. We know that efforts to block Black voters from the ballot box can have a galvanizing effect, right? I mean, we know that motivated Black voters in record numbers in the middle of a pandemic in 2020, but I wonder what your reaction is to a mindset of out-organizing or out-legislating voter suppression. Is this harmful for our democracy?
Yeah, let me clarify, because I have had the opportunity to meet with both the president and with the vice president. And I will say the words out-organize were never used to me, right? So I have not heard that directly from them. I certainly have heard messages about organizing and about the importance of organizing, which of course we know. And so I think that caused some concern. But we also heard that they understand the nature of the emergency we're in. I will say that I left the meeting that I was in with the president with a sense that they understood the emergency. There's no doubt about that. The question always is going to be, what do you think is necessary to deal with the emergency, right? And I do think that there is a hope that, much like 2020, right? If we mobilize, we can overcome whatever is thrown in our path. But what I want to say is that everything we're seeing right now is a response to the mobilization of 2020. So we know that mobilization can't be the answer. It's a response to the litigation of 2020, when so many of us went all in. I mean, for heaven's sakes, we sued the United States Postal Service, making sure that we could get those ballots delivered, in critical places in key cities where the ballots were not being delivered in a timely fashion. And we were in court on election day and the days after election day, getting those ballots delivered. So people, we were engaged in litigation that we never thought would happen. I love the United States Postal Service, but we had to do what we had to do. So what you're seeing right now is a reaction to litigation and organizing. And so therefore, we know that that's not going to be the answer, because precisely what they are doing is undercutting the effectiveness of those tools. I run a nonpartisan organization, so I am not shilling for any particular candidate or any particular party. I am in this for Black people's full citizenship and dignity and their right to participate in the political process. And early in my career, when I had to sue Democrats, which I did that. This period when we have had to sue Trump, when we've had to sue the RNC, we will do that. It is not partisan, it is on behalf of Black voters. And so for us, we just believe that that has to be the lodestar for the president as well. And that means, as we shared with him, that we want him to use all of his power and influence to make sure that this legislation can pass. And if that, means having very serious conversations with Joe Manchin, which I have no doubt he is likely having, he needs to understand, Manchin needs to understand, and Sinema needs to understand, whatever are your views, however, you regard what you think the filibuster is about or was supposed to accomplish, it is not accomplishing that. It is a Senate rule. It is not something that's in the Constitution. The founders didn't create it. It is not absolutely necessary for the governance of democracy. It has not had the effect of creating more bipartisanship, and it certainly won't around voting legislation, because that is where people see their ability to stay in office, and then all bets are off. So a Senate rule cannot overcome the right of Black people to equal protection, 14th Amendment, the right of Black people to vote free from discrimination, 15th Amendment, and Congress's obligation in the enforcement clauses of both those amendments to ensure that the heart of the amendments are actually brought to fruition. So that's what we're telling the president and the vice president. Absolutely, organizing has to happen. Absolutely, we're going to keep litigating, as I said earlier, but we've got to have this legislation, and we cannot allow a Senate rule to overcome the right of Black people to participate in the political process. It makes a mockery of the civil rights movement. It makes a mockery of the people who actually died, Medgar Evers and Jimmy Lee Jackson and so many others, and those who were beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It makes a mockery of their sacrifice to suggest that a Senate rule can overcome our constitutional right to be full citizens. So that's kind of where we stand. We're making that argument, as forcefully as we can to the president, and he heard it. And so I think a lot's being made about the out-organized piece. I think we were very clear that we can't out-organize and we can't out-litigate it. And to the extent that there are people in the White House emphasizing, organizing, we would say to them, this is the period to emphasize legislation. That this is what we need. And whatever organizing is happening right now is around getting these bills passed. It's about the fact that we need the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And now we need a fix for the Brnovich case.
Yeah. You mentioned Vice President Harris as part of this strategy too. This voting rights is an issue that the Vice President volunteered for as part of her portfolio. I'm wondering if you can talk to me about whether you have directly engaged with her on this issue, how you rate her response to this issue, and for people who don't kind of understand, what the Vice President can and can't do on this. Can she do more? Should she do more?
Well, as I keep saying to people, there's the public and the private. The truth is, none of us actually know what conversations are happening privately, and I have no doubt that they are happening. So whatever, there was a lot of discussion about the president's speech at the National Constitution Center, or even in a meeting with civil rights leaders. We came out and we talked about what happened in the meeting, so everybody knows what that was. Do I believe that there are conversations happening with members of Congress and pressure being brought to bear? If it isn't happening, they would be the first president and vice president not to be applying that pressure. So I have no doubt that they are. The vice president is someone who just left the United States Senate. Do I think that she's not, engaging in deep conversations about what is happening in the Senate with her former peers? I suspect that she is. So I don't have a doubt that she is also using whatever leverage she has. I want to believe that the president is using all of his power and leverage to try to make this happen. And we will see, in very short order, but it must happen because this legislation will come to the fore in September and it must be passed. Failure is not an option. And if that means jettisoning the filibuster and carving out an exception for laws that are directly related to the integrity of our democracy, like voting laws, then it has to happen. And that case has to be made very clearly to Senator Manchin and to Senator Sinema. We've made it as civil rights leaders directly to Senator Manchin. I hope that we'll be meeting with Senator Sinema because she needs to hear it directly also from those who represent communities who will be most affected by this nostalgic embrace of the filibuster.
Yeah, I mean, just wondering here, when was the last time that you reached out to Senator Sinema's office and were they responsive? I mean, do you have much hope that you will be able to engage with her on this issue to get her perspective, to try to bring her around to make the case for just what you were discussing?
Yeah, it's really my colleagues have been making that ask for that meeting, and these are not easy things to set up, especially in August. But I'm hopeful that it will happen.
Yeah. Well, at the executive, legislative, and activist level, it is Black women who are so often the modern day suffragists leading the way in the real fight to maintain election integrity. This is what election integrity is really about in this country. Why is that? Is there something about that dynamic that feels different today? Why are you as a Black woman so committed to this fight?
It's interesting. I mean, I respect my male colleagues, who've been standing shoulder to shoulder with us in this fight. I learned how to be a voting rights lawyer from two women, from Lonnie Guinier, legend, a brilliant voting rights lawyer and scholar who was at the Legal Defense Fund and was leaving as I came, and Pam Carlin, also brilliant voting rights attorney, law professor at Stanford, and now on leave, working in the Department of Justice. So I learned how to be a voting rights lawyer from those two women who supervised me in my early period at LDF. So it always seemed perfectly natural to me. And obviously, you know, the people who were my heroes when I was a kid and made me want to be a civil rights lawyer, because I could see the possibilities in it, you know, were people who were not civil rights lawyers, you know, Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan. But, you know, these were Black women who I admired tremendously. And my sense of the civil rights movement, you know, it was Fannie Lou Hamer. And I often tell, you know, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton, one of my favorite pictures is, you know, of her when she was a Yale law student and was sent to go help get Fannie Lou Hamer out of jail. And, you know, if you see that picture, you know, Eleanor Holmes Norton looks about, you know, 98 pounds soaking wet. She's so obviously young and green, but she looked like me, you know, she looked like a Black girl who just, you know, went down to Mississippi and was trying to make something happen. And so along with, you know, Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston and, you know, gosh, C.T. Vivian, you know, one of my personal heroes, and Fred Shuttlesworth and so many others, and John Lewis, were these, you know, incredible women who really set the path for me and gave me a sense of my desire to kind of be in the fray. And so I just never saw any barriers to it. It seems like the most important work that you can be doing in a democracy. It doesn't in any way mean that the work I'm doing around criminal justice, the work I'm doing around economic justice, the work I'm doing around education and race is not equally important. But the framework is our ability to influence our destiny, our ability to decide how decisions are going to be made, what policy investments are going to be made, what financial investments are going to be made, what are going to be the rules that govern our lives. That's the framework of the whole thing. And so we have to get that right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think part of that is, you know, I know folks like you and me that are kind of locked into this issue on a, you know, I mean, it's in our DNA. We are living and breathing this. We know that that is not the case for the entire electorate, and you know, still kind of waiting for, in the same way that there was a national reckoning on race around policing that brought out this kind of multicultural, multi-generational coalition to push back against the unrelenting killing of Black people in this country. We don't really see that same kind of effort, that same kind of coalescing around voting rights for people who are not necessarily affected by voter suppression. Can you just talk a little bit about why what is the case that you make to people who are not Black in this country about why the fight for voting rights should matter to every American?
Yeah, I'm increasingly having those conversations, and I always have. I've always refused to allow the conversation about voter suppression against Black people to be a conversation just with Black people. Because if you are undermining democracy, you are undermining it for all of us. And I believe this is one of the great errors that has been made, and it's the reason why we find ourselves in the situation we are in. While people believed that this was a niche issue that only affected one part of the population in one part of the country, they did not understand that it was a poison pill that would bring the whole democracy down. I actually think people get it now. I actually think what Trump revealed was that. In 2014, when we began challenging Texas's restrictive voter ID law, and we continued that litigation through 2017, during that same period, there was a challenge to the omnibus voter suppression law that North Carolina passed. And in both those cases, the courts found that those laws violated the Voting Rights Act. In North Carolina, you know, the law was found to be intentionally discriminatory. You may recall that the Fourth Circuit said it was the provisions were created with surgical precision to target Black voters. You know, the Texas legislature, you know, passed that voter ID law, the one that said, you know, you could use a concealed gun carry permit, but you couldn't use, you know, your tribal ID, or our clients couldn't use their state university ID to vote. And I said at the time, when legislatures are meeting to enact laws that will disenfranchise fellow citizens, we have a democracy problem. And I called it white supremacy at the time. Most people did not start reviving the term white supremacy until after Charlottesville. And yes, white supremacy is people marching through Charlottesville saying terrible things with torches lit, being intimidating and vilely racist. But it is also legislatures in our country meeting and passing laws designed to preserve the power of white people and to disenfranchise Black and brown people. That is also white supremacy. and the failure of white people to understand that that was a problem and that this was a threat to our entire country is part of the reason we have found ourselves in the situation that we are in now, where the very fundamental tenets of our democracy are threatened. So I don't have any problem talking to people about why this is their problem. If you didn't see it on January 6th as your problem, you never are going to see it. Either you want to live in a democracy or you don't. If you don't, we have nothing really to talk about. If you do want to live in a democracy, then I'm prepared to have the conversation with you about what we have to do to make sure that we do that. And that's going to mean you're being invested, not just in your own ability to vote, but in the person next to you, and the person across town, and the person in another city.
Yeah. And the idea, the belief that voting is a right and not a privilege. And I want to ask you a little bit about that too. I know my lived experience certainly informs the lens through which I view the importance of voting, my relationship to voting. I want to ask you about your relationship to voting. When did you first register to vote? You know, in every election, was she that kind of voter like my mom was? Talk to me about your relationship to voting.
My dad and my stepmom voted all the time. And at the local school, and my father would take my sister and I have a sister who's a year older than I, and he would take us with him to the polls in the evening. It was always in the evening after work. So I had that sense of people who couldn't vote in the morning before work, had to get to their job, couldn't vote all day because he didn't work in the same borough where we lived, right? And so it was something you came home, you tried to get some dinner, and then you got in the line to vote. So that was the experience I had, and I couldn't wait to vote. We were a very kind of political minded family. I watched the news all the time with my dad, and so I couldn't wait to vote. And but I was away at school, so my first vote was absentee. And yeah, so which is why I get the importance of absentee voting, because I couldn't wait. As soon as I turned 18, I wanted to be able to vote. And that was the first vote that I cast. And I don't think, I may have missed, an off-year election, maybe a primary once or twice. I don't miss voting. This is it's very, very important to me, and I love it. And actually, I've had to even check myself, because I actually am one of the people who likes voting in person. I like to be online and see my neighbors and have that conversation and so forth. I don't want to be online for 9 hours, let's be clear. 30 minutes, but I really see, young people, I see my own children, so, they want to be able to vote absentee. They want to have access to these other opportunities to participate in the political process. Early voting, people really love, I love it too. I've been early voting quite a bit. So opening our minds up to how we make voting as convenient as it can be for as many people as possible, and there are as many channels for people to be able to vote, I think is just so important. And it should just be a normal part of life. The provision in the For the People Act would make Election Day a national holiday. Really? Is that controversial? We don't have bipartisan support for that. I mean, I just don't get it. These are things that should be just part of, part of American life.
Yeah. Well, I want to end with just circling back to the theme of our summit this year, which is representation matters. And so to close us out, I wonder if you can just tell our audience what your idea of representation is as it pertains to voting rights, and how they need to represent, how you plan to represent coming out of this week, headed into the rest of this year and beyond.
I mentioned that I learned how to be a voting rights litigator from Lani Guinier, the great voting rights litigator and scholar. And in one of her articles, it stuck with me, maybe from 1989 or 1990. She said that those who were voting rights activists during the civil rights movement, were all in around voting, even at risk of their own safety, livelihood, and lives, because they believed that being able to participate in the political process would change the material condition of their lives, would enable them to change the material condition of their lives. In other words, it wasn't just the ceremonial act of voting. Of course, there is a dignity associated with that, but it was because they believed in the translation of that vote into power that would allow them to change the material condition of their lives and of their communities. And I've never forgotten it. I say it all the time. I'm mindful of it because I think sometimes we forget that second part. And there are many people who just focus on the ballot being cast, whoever wins or loses the election. I think much of our news coverage focuses in that way. It makes elections seem like that's what it's about, but actually it's about this second piece. And to the extent we have people who have checked out of the process of voting and of the electoral process, it's because we haven't delivered on the second part. We haven't delivered on people being able to see the connection between their vote and a change in their life circumstances. If you came out on the streets, millions of people last year because you saw the video of George Floyd being killed and you wanted something to be killed, something to be changed, then you have to ask yourself this year, okay, now what? Where is the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act? And if we have a George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, does it include the elements that are likely to actually deter the kind of brutality and inhumanity that we saw in that video? Will it end qualified immunity, which essentially has been functioning as a regime of impunity for police officers engaged in brutality and unconstitutional policing? People need to see the translation of their vote into a transformation in their lives. And that's what real representation is supposed to deliver. It's not supposed to just deliver a face. It's not even supposed to just deliver a face that looks like me, a Black woman. It's supposed to deliver the things. It's supposed to deliver the changes that people want to see in their life. It's supposed to deliver real transformation in the lives of your children and of your community. And until we start delivering on that, we will continue to have what we have in this country, which are abysmal turnout rates in elections, particularly in off-year elections. And we should be trying to change that. It's not just about, we had the highest turnout in any presidential election last year, and we should celebrate it. Absolutely, it's wonderful. Still wasn't great, but it was wonderful in comparison to other years. But what about other elections? Why isn't there high turnout in school board elections? Why isn't there high turnout in sheriff elections? We're all, we've been in this controversy this summer over the, now extended eviction moratorium. Who evicts people from their homes? It's the sheriff. It's the constables. Do people show up in that election? So I think we have to start demanding more of what representation means and having much more dynamic and sophisticated conversations about our political system and what it is supposed to deliver for ordinary people.
Well, that's just the perfect note to end on. Thank you for representing, Sherrilyn. Thank you for asking our audience to represent. I will definitely be watching and covering your efforts as the battle over the ballot box continues.
Thank you, Erin. Please keep on doing what you all are doing at the 19th. It's just so wonderful. I'm so proud of all of you and so pleased to be associated with this opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What a week. Thank you to absolutely everyone who made this 19th Represent Summit so special. We are incredibly grateful for the opportunity to share this programming and these voices with all of you.
A special thanks again to our founding sponsor, Supermajority Education Fund, our presenting sponsor, the Impact Seat, and supporting sponsors, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, the Facebook Journalism Project, and the Tory Burch Foundation. A final thanks to our media partner, the PBS NewsHour.
To our more than 10,000 members, we are so glad you're here and so grateful for you. If you liked what you saw this week, we hope you'll join the 19th. We're a member-supported newsroom and simply can't put on events like this without the support of people like you. You can join by donating now at 19thnews.org/membership. You can also support our nonprofit newsroom by signing up for our free newsletter at 19thnews.org/subscribe. If you missed any part of this week's programming or you just want to rewatch it, visit 19thnews.org/summit. Now that you know us, please stick with us. You can read our daily journalism, sign up for our newsletter, attend future events, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at 19th News. Everybody, have a great weekend. We can't wait to see you back here for our next event.